All right, there's enough people in here finally. We're going to have to get into the big story of the day. I know a lot of you have been waiting, you've been watching, biting your fingernails off. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Who's got it? Who's got footage live and direct from White Man Air Force Base in Missouri as the B 2 Spirit bombers take off, soaring into the sky, loaded down with a deadly duo of GBU 57 massive ordnance penetrator, 30,000 pound bunker busters, turning right when they hit 60,000 feet over the Zagros Mountains, only to be called off at the last second. Secretary Nome's shellfish allergy has struck. She's in the hospital. All B2s must return to Missouri. Just kidding. Just kidding. That's not what everybody here to talk about. It's clearly the most important news of the day that Elon Musk has, to great fanfare, showed a totally real drug test screenshot on Twitter. You guys may have missed that. Totally real. He's been posting through it. He's not even mad. He's laughing about a 5 or 6 month old story or series of stories from some woman at the Wall Street Journal. He hasn't been thinking about it at all. He totally forgot that he'd taken the drug test and the results have showed up, and so he's just posting about it on the timeline. Oh, no, sorry, that wasn't the big story. It was that the Senate has passed the giant crypto scam act and passed it on to the House. Now, Representative Cynthia Loomis of Wyoming, or sorry, Senator Loomis of Wyoming, has finally gotten her wish, a strategic crypto reserve. I'm sure David Sachs's net worth will not triple or quadruple or anything like that. Lot going on. Clearly, everybody's mind is actually on Iran and not on all this other stuff that's getting snuck in under the radar, like no caps on H-2A agriculture worker visas, as the White House walks back Trump's earlier statement about rescinding raids against illegals who work on farms. So a lot of shell games going on. But besides the things you guys are seeing on the timeline, besides the kind of content that the indefatigable stealth medical, I don't know. I guess I follow a lot of swamp creatures and unsavory types, and for some reason, anytime I go to the For You page on mobile, I see the little purple band up at the top of the page, and it's like Yoram Hazoni's son listening in to the stealth medical Hasbara spaces, and I listened to one for maybe like 10 minutes a day max over like the last 3 days. And every time, I don't care what time of day it is, they got one going on, but I don't care what time of day it is, you'll listen in there and some guy will chime in and he'll go like, oh my God, Israel Hayom Haaretz. The Jerusalem Post has reported, I-24 News has reported that American airstrikes are underway on the ventilation shaft at Fordo, and it never happens. So, look, you know, I I tend to play on the margins. There's no point in getting into a dunk contest with Michael Jordan, and there's no point in being the seventh person fighting over the scraps of the breaking news developing, breaking. There's no point in trying to be the 15th Dom Lucree in the Middle Eastern event monitoring space. Okay, so there's some funny things I've picked up on the margins. One of the literally marginal factions within the kind of tech right sector, whatever you want to call this new investor coalition that was brought in around the vice presidency of J.D. Vance. Wow, only 6 short months ago. Was that all? I guess it was longer than that. Never mind. It was like 10 months ago. Time flies. Were the Tech Iranians? Techranians? Not really sure what to call it. These are Iranian diasporics that settled, I'm sure, with their parents as their parents fled Iran in their private jets stuffed with gold bars in 1979. They just happened to land in Los Angeles. For those of you who don't know, you're not really aware of like the code. There are two types of Persians in Los Angeles that fled the rising theocracy. There are the Persians with an echo, right? Persians, Persians, Persians. And those would be the court Jews of the Pahlavi regime that fled, heavy into LA real estate. Many of them are actually Persians, and they're not necessarily ethnically Jewish, so can be impossible to pick apart. You probably have seen Neo Berg on the timeline pronouncing the Shah's son, also named Reza Pahlavi, so it's kind of confusing. And his mom is still alive. I guess the old queen, or whatever they called her, the Shastress, still alive. She's been promoting him as the king of Iran. And I've seen Iram Hazoni's son Hadar promoting him as the crown prince of Iran. I like how they have to use aristocratic language that whites would understand. You remember, always know your audience. So I've been enjoying the Shah posting. And look, there's some stuff that's on its, no pun intended, on its nose. Obviously, Iranian Jews like Neo Berg have a vested interest. It's kind of a peanut butter and jelly approach to putting a descendant of the Shah back on the peacock throne. Along with the rest of you guys, I'm learning about the nomenclature of the long forgotten Iranian aristocracy. But also, you have the tech Iranians. The most visible of those would be Dara Khosrowshahi. As far as I've seen, he doesn't really have much of a real footprint on social media, but he runs Uber. So he is, the world's cab master. And he was most recently in the White House with a couple hardcore Israeli funders, Michael Dell of Dell Computers, big time uh, Israeli mega billionaire, super donor, and Brad Gerstner, the diminutive esoteric venture capitalist. And they were kind of motivating this $1,000 per baby market fund account. That's totally not just some way to prop up, it's totally not some way to just help prop up the stock market as tech companies like Palantir enter the S&P 500. Definitely not. It's not just a giant federal, it's not a more eclectic form of quantitative easing. And who knows if it'll even go through. But I saw Dara Khosrowshahi's bald head, his distinctive visage at that meeting, and remember in a flash, oh, I had a flashback. Oh, inauguration ball, flashback. There's Dara Khosrowshahi and Peter Thiel with Barry Weiss at the Free Press slash Uber co-branded slash X, triple co-branded Trump inaugural ball. So he definitely sits on the verges of that as more of an Arabist, right? He didn't show up at the RNC with a bag of cash. He showed up to, once it was fait accompli, the inauguration for transition funding. Trump, of course, will accept all kisses, all ring smooches, all $1 million duffel bags at any time accepted. But the more prominent player, a little darker perhaps, Shervin Pishivar. Great name. Shervin Pishivar. I'm not going to spell it. I'll leave the phonetic translation up to you guys. He's a bit of a deeper venture capital tech player out of Silicon Valley with the requisite Joe Lonsdale-esque rape allegation in his background. So he's got at least 1 point on the board. I see some of you in here who are raising your eyebrows and going, okay. He's got all kinds of zany tech schemes with his money. He put some satellites into space, I'm sure, on a Elon rocket to mine crypto in space. He's got like permanent, I guess, totally secure on satellite crypto operations going on. That's some of the stuff he posts about. His bio on Twitter is crazy because it's just a giant caps lock list of all the unicorns that he's bought into at some phase or another. So he definitely is cashed up, but if you go and look at his timeline today, here's Shervin standing in front of a vast field of, it has to be hundreds of Starlink units that are palletized. They look like they came right out of the factory. They're still on the pallet, they're all wrapped up. And he said, well, here was the last time Elon and I worked together, to infiltrate Starlink units over the border into Iran during the Masa Amini protests, several years ago. Here I am in an undisclosed location, probably Azerbaijan, right, for you geopole heads. And now he's been pushing, although without a whole lot of support vociferously for the neo Shah himself, but the a Persian Spring. You guys remember the Arab Spring and Twitter's centrality to democratic operations in Libya? super successful track record, of course. Egypt, super successful democratic track record after social media was airdropped into those countries just 15 short years ago. Well, they want to do it again. This is one of the schemes, and it's obvious if you have a ton of family members left over there. Shervin talks about being born in Tehran, and he wants to go back home, but he can't do it until a reliable ally is on the peacock throne. So Starlink it is. He's putting out a big call. He's sounding, I don't know what the Iranian version of a shofar is. Maybe he just taps on somebody else's shoulder and tells them to sound the shofar. But they're very linked up. There's a bizarre circle of Iranian influencers operating in the United States as part of the diaspora that are completely on board with this. But they seem to have this fusionist line that you see the erstwhile, like, on board against the war MAGA supporter types are now retreating to, right? Well, hey, Trump promised to knock out the Iranian nuclear, but he's just running out his campaign promise. Remember when Trump promised to knock out the Iranian nuclear campaign? He's just running on his. That's all we're gonna do. Is just gonna be. We just hand over the bunker busters. And so the Iranian types are doing this as well. The restorationists. Okay, this is what they seek: the restoration of the Shah to the peacock throne, or a Shah. And so obviously they don't want full scorched earth, ground pounding, send in the Marines destruction of Iran unless they have the long Adam King play. Little inside joke for some of you, about being able to rebuild Gazan concrete dust from the ground up as totally devalued land into beachfront condos. So, yeah, there's a bizarre mix of legislative allies there as well. Corey Mills. Some of you in here may even be represented by Corey Mills, the strange congressman from Florida. I saw this week turning some heads, not for his bizarre associations with this Iranian Israeli axis, but his super badass 3D, like Instagram 3D style US Capitol tattoo on his tricep. I don't know if you guys caught that thing. It's wild. Um, the boomerist thing is very real. But Corey Mills, he's in a little bit of hot water right now. Apparently was engaged in arms dealing, international arms dealing, while a member of Congress. Little out there. But his connection to the Iranian diaspora operation seems to be through his mistress, Sarah Raviani, who I follow on here. And there was like a dust up a couple months ago where she called the police, and Representative Mills was beating on her, and then they got back together. Now by the time I saw that in the news, I went and looked at her timeline, and she was like all dolled up with Mills on her arm. He's married to another woman, by the way, and Raviani's just posting pictures of them like in tux and tails and evening wear, arm in hand, right, clearly ready to head out. And the rest of her timeline is all, don't turn Iran into concrete dust before we've secured the peacock throne for Reza Pahlavi. So the restorationist thing's been interesting. I saw Rob Amari. Look, lots of vowels in the space tonight. He moved over from Compact Magazine to Unheard, and he had a recent article about the regime change predilection rising again in American conservatism, and a little bit of inside baseball since he's also a former Tehrani himself, a former Tehran born Iranian. I think Amari's deal was like he was, born as a theocrat or whatever you call your average Iranian patriot. I don't know what that is. Pro theocracy Iranian, a pro theocracy Persian, somehow escaped Iran or went into the West for school and became a communist, as one does in college, unironically like a Trotskyite. Then, as Trotskyites often do, became a neoconservative. So, became a free Iran from the people I used to support as a child guy, and then became a hardcore traditionalist Catholic after converting. I guess what's that? The second conversion, along with like Adrian Vermeule and some of these other Ivy League, ivory tower Catholic converts. So anyway, he's had a very peculiar journey through life. And I was reading his latest article in Unheard where he said, I have sources in the diaspora community who are, I think he said they're collaborators with the Shah, with Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah, who's been living, I think, in either Paris or Washington, D.C. Very charmed life, living all over the world for the last 45 years. And he said, oh, but they say that Pahlavi is lazy and he's incurious. So he doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence. It doesn't seem to be any reportage about support for the Pahlavis on the ground in Iran. They kind of ran the place into the ground before a massive revolution overthrew them and then spent the next like 5 years figuring out who would win the revolution. So everybody was set against the Shah's rule at the end of his time in power. And then they literally threw him out, sorted it all out later. You guys can go read about the vagaries of the Islamists ousting and murdering the Tudeh communists of Iran, chasing the Mujahideen al-Khalq cult into the deserts of Iraq, who are probably the point people in the Leave Behind network that's been facilitating Mossad operations in Iran. Very sordid, tentacled affair. But yeah, I've been enjoying the restorationist surge over the last like 3 days. Anybody can request to speak if you have a question or you have anything to say about anything that's in the news right now. It's a very free flowing space before America First with Nicholas J. Fuentes inevitably comes on at 9 p.m. Eastern on the dot, sharp. Although he did have a big guest appearance on Alex Jones today. So catch that if you didn't. Side note, you may want to be careful if you're trying to catch those live on a normal computer. I couldn't keep watching more like the first 20 minutes or something of the live Twitter feed from that interview earlier today. I switched to my laptop and I go, hey, how hard could it be? I'll go to the InfoWars website. They'll have a live link right there on the main page. Never have tried this before. I click through to it and they're like, watch it live. It has like a stock photo of one of those gumdrop style undercover police car lights that like the detectives in the 1980s movies would throw on the roof when they got in the chase. So I click on that. My laptop fans immediately go nuclear. They go Chernobyl. The laptop is like shaking. It's heating up. It's starting to glow. Three audio feeds and video feeds activate at the same time. Live Alex Jones through Twitter somehow, and then that dude with the glasses. Obviously, not a big Infowars fan. So, and he was like taking boomer call-ins. So, I'm not a fake fan. If so, what I'm saying, I'm getting ahead of it, right? If one of you is going to call and say, "Hey, in hour two of Nick's interview on Alex Jones, when Alex said this," I am not going to be in a position to like play it off, laugh through it. I'm going to have to replay gang that from a safer location, like a Rumble replay or something. So, lots of content. The restorationist stuff is interesting. Uh, Hazoni's son posting the Shah in waiting's speech at the fourth National Conservatism Conference from over the summer was kind of funny. I suppose it slipped my mind. Everyone was focused on that dwell time between NatCon and the RNC being taken up by, Trump getting shot in the head by a would-be assassin who, hey, look, depending on how things go here in the next couple days, your grandchildren may report you to the police in 40 years because they overheard grandpa telling them that it wasn't the Iranians that tried to kill Trump in 2024. I was there. It wasn't what they say. So I thought it was funny that the Shah had also spoken in that for because this was the speech J.D. Vance gave right before his nomination, like a week before. And it was the same speech. I remember Nick watched the Vance NatCon 4 speech on a stream. And then, like, what, a week later, maybe a week and a half later, Vance was giving like 80% of that speech at the RNC. And of course, Scott Bessent before he became America's first gay Treasury Secretary. Man, imagine the smell. Scott Bessent spoke there. Steve Bannon was even brought into the coalition. And, it was a fully stacked deck, so to speak. But it was interesting to see, against perhaps the wishes of many of the befuddled Zoomers who find themselves roped into the National Conservative oeuvre, that Yoram Hazony was like, "What's the big deal? President Trump is just holding true to his campaign promise of the complete and total destruction of all Persian power. What's the big deal?" After holding back, it is funny time and time again. Well, it has to be funny because otherwise it would be terribly sad and infuriating to see people be like, no, 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 no. He's not that kind of those. Okay. He's not actually one of them because look, why else would he support Tulsi Gabbard? Why else would they draw people who are against war in Iran so deeply into institutions of power that have been controlled by neoconservatives for 40 years? Why would, instead of them burning their political capital trying to keep pro peace voices out of important positions and tip their hand and infuriate Trump by blocking his nomination agenda and preventing him from rewarding some of the Pied Pipers that brought Democrat voters into the GOP over the last year? Instead, why don't they just, draw them into these institutions with permanent bureaucracies and civil military leadership in the Pentagon that runs on a career basis, that has a friendly relationship with career Pentagon journalists like Jennifer Griffin, who are, uncritical mouthpieces that help promote a uniquely political or parapolitical vision for these institutions? Why not just entrap these people in these institutions? Hey, instead of fighting the Charles Koch funded foreign policy libertarians, why don't we just throw them into the swamp and watch them drown each other in an attempt for one of them to escape? And then that'll solve that problem. That'll solve that problem. Hey, I've got an idea. Why don't we actually give ourselves some credibility with the Iranian negotiators by making Tulsi Gabbard a totally toothless director of national intelligence, then completely marginalizing her because she's in office. And if she was outside the power structure, she would actually be able to exert pressure on it rather than be subsumed by it. So I hope you guys are learning lots of interesting metapolitical lessons. I am. I'm not going to pretend I sat back. Oh, everyone's going to be mad at me for predicting this ahead of time, so I won't. But I will pretend that I did when something bad happens down the road. Not doing that. If you're learning these lessons, I'm learning right along with you. And hey, 4-year cycles give plenty of opportunities. Some of you Zoomers are, it's like looking down the barrel of a shotgun. And you're like, 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus, there's probably going to be an 8 in there. You're hearing yourself becoming 40 years old. The hammer's clicking back. It's already over. Look, it's one of those things where you look back from 60 at the 40 years between being 20 and 60 like it was, 40 weeks and not 40 years. So don't fret. We're not running out of time. There's plenty of time. Okay. So, standard like white pill disclaimer. I don't see anybody requesting to speak here. I think some of you get a little too used to just sitting around listening to old Wendell tell spooky campfire stories with a laugh here or there to relieve the existential pressure. But anybody can request. You can control the microphone. I don't want to say what I was about to say there because it might scare some of you off. But look, nobody's calling in anyway. Sometimes it has to be like a ludus, right? From the opening act of Gladiator, maybe the beginning of the second act. The ludus is like the gladiator school where it's only a wooden sword. But if you come up here and you're getting kind of weird, I might just have to, we'll work on it instead of me casting you out. Okay, Thornblood. Thornblood, any thoughts? Picking up any interesting alpha on the Iranian situation?
On Iran, unfortunately, that is one thing that is a little over my head, but is still a little relevant to it since you mentioned the likes of NatCon. There is a group that you, I, and a few others are looking more into that is connected to NatCon with the names such as Nate Fisher and Scott Yenner and a few others such as from the new founding company. And one of the things that I've been looking into more that kind of all of us already knew, but I'm not sure many of us knew the jargon, like essentially the marketing language that they're trying to pull, is they're using this fake form of Caesarism called Red Caesarism. A lot of it is from Charles Haywood, Curtis
All
Yarvin, the
right, look,
usual
look, look,
folks.
look, hold up. All right. So back in the day on the forums, they had this term. It was like not your personal army. So here's the smoother way to do it. All right. Ludus moment. The wooden swords are out. You're not going to die. But if you just, while you were saying all that, I went right to Nate Fisher's profile. Okay. And 34 minutes ago, he posted, unlike some on the right, I'm not categorically opposed to any foreign intervention. Okay. Orange flag, right? He's hedging right away. He's saying,
Yes.
you saw Vice President Vance earlier today with a giant post, which is usually a red flag, right? When they have the gigantic post. Let's see. See, Corn Coin is also requesting. I'll let him in. I mean, you can speak here after I finish going off, but I don't want anybody to wait dying on the vine thinking they've been forgotten. So Vance had that giant effort post today where he's like, dude, okay, like I know it seems like a big deal, but it's actually not. Like it's not that bad. He's
Yeah.
doing those hedging things. So yeah, here's
Yeah.
Fisher ping
It's getting
ponging.
ridiculous.
He's ping ponging, right? I'm not categorically opposed
Yes.
to any foreign intervention, but we need to be cautious about it. The current geopolitical situation is complex, and the U.S. is a central player. I want it debated and decided by wise and knowledgeable statesmen focused on America's best interest. And then he goes after, uh, the head of the Family Research Coalition or whatever, or Family Research Council. So he goes after kind of a weaker, more centrist establishment power in Tony Perkins because Fisher's big thing lately, wasn't he part of this CBL thing or whatever that was going on with Wolf? William, not Stephen.
Yeah, I was about to say totally different wolf. Yeah, I think Dark Donnie knows a little bit more about that one in
Did you
particular.
see Willie
But
Wolf
when it
posting the same thing? I think yesterday about like,
yeah,
dude, it's
similar
like I
things.
get why you guys are
Yes.
mad, but it's probably not
So
like a big
one of
deal.
Yeah, so one of the things that is right behind this, the obvious part is him, as you were just saying, kind of just bouncing off of Vance and trying to placate people. But one of the things that I noticed for those that are essentially the ones placated, the way they market themselves is this fake Caesarism where they disguise it that way when it's really Bolshevism. And they don't tell people that. Obviously, they wouldn't. I don't, why would they? But that is how they have advertise themselves to those that essentially are trying to draw into placation. And in this case, that's the current thing, right? In dealing with this stuff with Iran, dealing with the immigration ping ponging back and forth, and the things that they talk about in order to obfuscate from JQ and Israeli influence, a lot of the times is using terms like managerial state. There's It's just a very funny language game that once again, many of us are familiar with in terms of going like, "Oh, they're just not willing to say Jews or something
All
of
right,
the
well
like,"
let's lasso
or
it. Let's lasso it back into current events. You're bringing up the kind
yeah,
of red Caesarism is what they used to call it. It was a
yeah,
Claremont established idea around like NatCon 2. And a few years ago, there was a picture of a group, of, I think four guys, and it was in black and white. And it was like behind the scenes at yeah, I think it was Nat. It might have been NatCon 2 or maybe NatCon 3, and it was Daryl Cooper. Dave Rabbi
yeah.
or Dave Raboy, the bodybuilding midget, and it was Michael Anton, who is now the head of the State Department's think tank. He's director of policy planning at the U.S. State Department and the technical lead on the Iranian nuclear negotiations. Going great, Mike. Everything's going great. Michael Anton really delivering as lead negotiator for the State Department's interests. And then I think the other one was Matt Peterson, who formerly lead trainer for Claremont's fellowships and now has his own vertical at The Blaze. He's got his own TV show over there. And Anyway. So let's think about Caesarism. Why is Caesarism? Most of you hearing the term Caesarism, you're like, Julius Caesar? Yeah. But why is it difficult to define? Why is it so tempting? Because it's a flexible form of authoritarianism. It's not easily defined. And this is Caesar's sacrificial power at the end of the Republic, right? Doing tragically nearly whatever it took to prevent the Republic from lapsing into its inevitable orgy of violence that follows Caesar's death. And it's this terrible thing, right? Caesar's own nephew, Octavian, becomes the first emperor after murdering, as heir apparent. Caesar had made Octavian his heir before he had any children of his own. But then, of course, Caesar goes on to have a child, Caesarion, with Queen Cleopatra. So by the time of Caesar's passing, he has two legitimate heirs, and one consolidates power by slaying the other. Caesarion's murdered. Cleopatra and Antony complete their suicide pact, and Octavian becomes Augustus, first emperor of Rome. The Republic dies forever, never comes back. It's over, right? So the Caesarists fall out. Caesar's own cabal would have been the Caesarists, right? And then they stabbed him in the back too. Have you seen Dave Raboy and Daryl Cooper going at it on the timeline? It's vicious. It's brutal. If they were ever friends, it constitutes a betrayal. I'm not quite sure who's Brutus in this situation. Digital knives don't reach very far, but think about the various paths that the Caesarists took. I think even Charles Haywood, he might have been in that picture as well. The
He
yeah,
was.
black person shampoo magnate of Indiana turned aspiring suburban warlord, right? This is the whole Haywood thing. He's only reviewing books while he waits for society to inevitably collapse and him to come out on top, just like stirring coconut oil into a vat of black person shampoo, just as one does. Just as one does in the
Wonderful picture.
shampoo plant. So Caesarism is a very thin veneer by which like these people are bound together. Okay, it didn't hold. None of them seem to really be, except for perhaps Dave Raboy, enjoying the fruits of association with its most powerful extant, who would be Michael Anton at this point. And Dave Raboy gleefully thrilled with the performance of Michael Anton in his role, destroying any possibility of peace with Iran. Michael
Mm.
Anton. Look, I don't know if it's true or not, but let's just consider the circumstantial evidence. Michael Anton may, in fact, be throwing wrenches, clogs, whatever, into the gears of Iranian American peace. So, yeah, I mean, something like Caesarism, like you said about managerialism, kind of like almost formless or meaningless. What do you mean? And they won't say it, right? The point is not to say
It's
it.
depersonalized.
And so is Caesarism. So these people
Yeah.
aren't developing any kind of coherent ideology. Right now, what they're doing is just acting as a cattle guard for MAGA. The
Yes,
cattle guard
and
keeps
that's what I was
the
trying to
cow
point
isn't going to
out is that's
cross
what's happening right now.
it, right? Yeah, the
Yeah,
cow isn't
with
going to
Iran
cross it.
is they're
He's
breaking
not
apart to
sure.
whatever degree.
Yeah, the cow looks down. He's not sure if a grate is solid or not, so he won't cross it. And that's what they're doing. Well, hey, wait a minute. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Since when were we opposed to any foreign intervention? But I certainly wouldn't want it to be acted out by this piece of shit who I'm trying to hey, look, let me just rope this guy into the situation here, right? Hey, let me anybody want to join in my personal crusade against Tony Perkins to catch strays? So yeah, there's a lot of kind of re-engineering and repurposing, but at the same time, because it lacks boldness, it's got 80 likes. There's a lot of that going on. Okay, anybody can speak here. We got Corn Coin. All right, Corn Coin.
Hey, Wendell.
And you
We're I'm
yeah.
curious. Bloomberg threw out this headline about Russia backing away from Iran. Where does China end up in all this? Obviously, Khamenei's going to retaliate at some point if there's a threat on his life. Um, if they end up closing the Hormuz, China stands the most to lose.
Well, look, I'm at.
So,
Oh, that was great. That was bar. Bar. Can we get some fire emojis in the chat here? That was a bar.
thanks, bro.
All right. You know what? I'm at the battle station. I've got bookmarks open. And so we're going to the swamp creature bookmarks. Okay. My bookmarks are crazy. I don't know if any of you guys use bookmarks on Twitter. If you use a desktop computer, you can like search bookmarks a lot easier than perhaps on your phone. So search your bookmarks. Use the search bar for bookmarks. Okay. So, look, I told you a lot of vowels, a lot of strange sounding names. I saw that guy. There's that guy OW Root that's like, "Hey, here's me pretending to be a 1980s Benetton ad, but I'm definitely not a male model." Like you see that guy Necktie Salvage or something. And I saw his timeline today where he looked like washed, dude. He looked like he'd been through some shit. He'd clearly been drinking hard liquor straight, and he was smoking a cigar and posting a selfie. Right? He was looking rough. And I went through his timeline because, I know what most people don't know about that guy because I use the Twitter search function that's conveniently integrated into people's bios and profiles. It's that little magnifying glass. And, one of the real disciplinary practices as a groiper, I saw that video the other day, it went viral, of a Buddhist monk, and he was genuflecting, and he was surrounded by like 20 kittens, and they were getting all in his robe and everything, like batting at him. It was great. It was hilarious. But he wouldn't move, right? He was fulfilling his duty. One of your duties is to, at random, when you go through, if you're going to make the commitment to go through to somebody's profile, and almost nobody does that, you have to click the magnifying glass and type the word like Jew and then maybe like Israel and just check. Okay. Just check. And so I looked at OW Reed's timeline today and he was going through it for the last like 4 days. He's not posting like Abercrombie and Fitch ads or whatever that he saved on Pinterest anymore. He's like, dude, you cannot pay attention to Middle Eastern events. Please do not involve you will it's like a drug, okay? You will not be able to get off the dopamine carousel if you start being a Middle Eastern reporting, breaking news guy. Please, like, stop. And he's like panting, right? And then he's got that picture of himself, like he looks cooked. He's totally baked. But I know he is Israeli. He's Israeli. So you got these accounts like Nate Fisher right now. What do I do? What do I do? If I post that I'm Israeli right now, if I post pictures from when I lived in Israel, I am gonna get shit on by maybe I don't want to know. Maybe 60% of my followers are gonna feel personally betrayed. They know that I waited until President Trump's finger hovered over the B2 GBU 57 button to throw my 2 cents in, to move the needle. If I made the right post at the right time, would this be the difference between the GBU 57 careening into through 80 meters of concrete and Zagros Mountain rock into the enrichment hall at Fordow, taking a big cinematic bounce before thousands of pounds of explosive tear the place apart, sending Iran's strategic deterrent into a rocky grave for decades. You get the idea. So it's tough out there, but I bookmark the good stuff. I have to be disciplined to only laugh a little bit. And then I remember to click the bookmark button. So we're going to Zaineb Rabua. Okay. I told you there's going to be some challenging names when we get to this stuff. Zaineb is an Atlas Jew. So Atlas Jews, that's literally what they call themselves. Okay. Atlas Jews are Jews from the Atlas Mountains of like Morocco. Yeah, I think it's Morocco. I'm not going to lie. Sometimes North Africa, not a lot going on. It's not ending up in the news very often. But she's an expert at the Hudson Institute on Chinese affairs in the Middle East. And her whole blog is China in the Middle East and North Africa. So she had an interest. She's always got interesting takes. Now, that doesn't mean I'm a fake cell. Doesn't mean I'm a simp. Okay. It means that unlike, uh, you know, the non believer monotheists who act only by laws and never by faith, I can separate facts from values. All right. As a Christian, I know the source of capital T truth. I know the difference between that and facts. Okay. And clearly I don't need to inject values into observing geopolitical issues beyond my own interests. without context first. So she had an interesting post 2 hours ago. China isn't intervening because it can't. If China comes out publicly to support and defend Iran, it would provoke hostility from Israel, which China needs in terms of tech cooperation. You guys may remember an infamous red-headed political operative who seems to be undergoing a series of Barry Lyndon-esque legal issues that never actually seem to end with him incarcerated, which is even more mysterious. Layers of mystery. Some say he's the man that convinced Peter Thiel to become an FBI informant. Some would say that. Some would say that a close reading of the articles about that incident would have you know that his FBI code name was Genius. So the red-headed political operative, literally stolen from the crib by Alan Dershowitz, literally taken at like 16 years old from the debate hall of his boarding school after jousting with Alan Dershowitz in a mock debate and brought into the highest areas of Ivy League law and then into the auspices of Cold War operatives turned congressmen like Dana Rohrabacher into was it? No, I got to be careful here. Was it the Peruvian? No, Venezuelan. What was the Latin American country that hosted Assange for like 5 years in a basement in London into the
Ecuador.
embassy? There we go, Ecuador. All right. Saved by Corn Coin, though, I was kind of hoping one of you guys would ask to speak just to say it, and then we get you on the hook and we start lining up the speakers here. So that guy would always use this term Chisraeli, but that guy would also absolutely never ever explain anything he was talking about ever beyond like the level of like a hint. But kind of like a hint with like looking over the top of your sunglasses, with smoke curling up from a cigarette. Yeah, like that kind of hint. Some people really enjoy the mystery. So give it a good 18 months of reading Substacks and things like that to try and figure some of these things out. So, but it's as simple as Wikipedia. I remember, what was the guy's name? The one Groiper. The guys used so many pseudonyms. Aaron, who said you can still get red pilled from Wikipedia because nobody reads, right? Nobody even reads Wikipedia. And so, at one point it was even on Wikipedia that China and Israel were each other's greatest defense technology partners since the reform opening up period, the Boluan Fanzhang period of China under Deng Xiaoping. So Israel became an early member of the Belt and Road Initiative. They were relying on China to build out heavy infrastructure inside Israel. Some say the Chinese J-10 indigenous fighter was in fact not indigenous. It was a extended development of the U.S. Israeli co-developed Lavi fighter jet. So there's a long track record of Sino-Israeli tech cooperation and partnership. And in many ways, their economies went through the same process at the same time. They both liberalized in the early 1980s at the stewardship and behest of certain skyscraper dwellers in New York City. Okay, so you get the idea. China probably wants Israel back. Under the Biden administration, there was an intense focus on divorcing Israel from Chinese aims and attempting to partner Israel with Japan as a means of giving them high-speed rail infrastructure. Japanese heavy industrial engineering could come into Israel and build out your on ramps or whatever. Israel was aggressively seeking a free trade agreement with Japan that was based on leveraging the free trade agreement Israel had with South Korea against Japan's auto industry, undercutting the price of Japanese auto imports with South Korean ones to, I guess, leverage the ancient Japanese blood memory of being the traditional dominator of the Korean Peninsula, whatever you want to call it. But why not get them both? What's the old joke about the young bull and the old bull up on the hill looking down at the cows? And the young bull says, why don't we go down there and fuck one of those cows? And the old bull says, why don't we run down there? And the old bull says, why don't we walk down there and fuck them all? So why, if you've pretended, at least for a time, to entertain the Biden administration's desires to divorce China from Israel after a 40-year partnership, do you think those ties just go away? And that for 2 or 3 years, all you have to do is just nod along. Oh, yeah, for sure, dude. Yeah, you're totally right. Oh, Taiwan. Oh, that's so true. Yeah. No, that's totally got a lot to do with Yeretz Israel. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Joe Biden. And then look, as soon as the pressure's off, China wants to shore up support. Israel is looking for a form of independence from U.S. aid, which means integrating themselves into global supply chains instead, integrating themselves into global markets. So instead of relying on $4 billion golden handcuffs when a Democrat is in power and they won't let you go after Ford out, Biden Biden will give you everything you want to turn Gaza into concrete dust, and he will not lift one finger to let you go into Iran. Trump, on the other hand, if you walk in, you might be able to fuck them both. So why rely on this roller coaster? Now, Trump's attempt to keep out of Iran, maybe, has been to give them everything they wanted in American universities, which Biden wouldn't do. That's an interesting take. So China's in this phase now where they're going around commiserating with the tariff club. And you guys might remember the kvetching when Israel got hit with 35% tariffs or something like that. I still hear that when CNN rolls out the Hasbara Brigade. So they've been going around like, oh, dude, tariffs. Oh, tariff. Oh, tariff suck. Tariff worse than when that one guy had bad soup diarrhea and the whole world got sick. All right, this is pretty stale. But you get the point. They're trying to go around and be the responsible global power. China understands that at the end of the value chain, the national value chain, right? So if you think about moving from China's posture in the 1980s as they begin to industrialize, there's plenty of studies on this. And you can actually go see pictorials of American economists and production engineers who go to China, and they are working in like those Pakistani gunsmith level, not factories, but like dudes with hammers squatting, turning like old truck leaf springs into AK-47 receivers that will then be turned into like Polytech semi-automatic AKs that are sold in the United States. Sold in the United States until the 1989 import ban from George H.W. Bush. And then embarrassingly, Bill Clinton allowed several shipments of those banned arms to get through. And they were tied to illegal Chinese campaign donations to him and Gore's 96 reelection campaign. Just a sordid affair, right? But that used to be state of the art in China, was essentially craftsmanship. Now, obviously, you got like laser wielding robots cranking out die cast chassis Tesla clones. So that's a value chain. You go from literal digging holes for no real reason other than to keep you digging holes instead of sitting around drinking three penis wine at home and smoking too many unfiltered cigarettes, to now shooting for a prestigious first world matching niche in high tech industry. But that's not the end of the value chain, is it? A lot of you guys will think like, well, Wendell, I wish we had that stuff. Okay. What happened though? Hey, Wendell, you remember when the United States was the manufacturing crown jewel of the world? Yeah. What came after that? And does that represent the next step up the value chain? Oh, financialization, the US dollar becoming the neo gold, right? That if we could just smelt enough of it, we could just move it in a molten flow into every nook and cranny in the world and thereby control commerce from the point of being the leader in the middle, right? The middleman. Anywhere somebody's gripping a handful of Benjamins, the Federal Reserve is winning. And this is in large part why Wall Street loves buying government debt. Wall Street loves buying government debt because a primary means of gaining control over US currency and the government itself. You hear all these bugbears about like, hey, China owns all this debt. If you look it up, it was just a year or two ago that the combined foreign purchases of US debt of all countries, 190 countries or whatever besides the United States, actually outstripped just US financial institutions' purchases of US debt. So when they seek to privatize portions of the government, like through Doge, and say, like, hey, I've got a private equity roll up that could do all your books. Hey, oh, treasury payroll from government employees. Why don't you get on to Ramp Capital? Says a guy who paid your inaugural ball $1 million so he could introduce your CFO, the treasury head of payments to Ramp Capital's CEO on his private jet. You get the idea. This is how the game is played. But this inevitably has not led, since the Reagan era, to any reduction in government spending, right? But an increase in government spending. At the same time that private industry has taken over more pseudo or quasi governmental roles. This is paid for by US financial institutions buying the very debt that those expenditures generate. And now they have a vote. And they, if they're in charge of a financial institution, literally are the first to receive freshly minted currency, whether digital or hard cash, directly from the Federal Reserve, an agglomeration of private banking interests, which is the chief difference between a central bank and a national bank. That's the end of the value chain if you're China. Why? Because unlike the United States, which potentially could be autarkic, meaning that we possess enough resources, especially within our sphere of influence, that we could probably just maintain a very harmonious domestic first market where we focus on the, in most countries are like this, overwhelming amount of financial transactions inside a country's economy are actually domestic exchange of goods and services. They are not foreign trade. That is a fraction of commercial output, even in a world trade leader like the United States. But China has yet to have all those resources. Even supply chains that they've come to control are typically something that they control the import of and the on point value add or refining of, like the turning of amalgam of different elements into a battery. So China relies on globalism. They benefit from globalism. There is no greater beneficiary in the globalist age of the last 45 years than China. So China stands a much better chance, perhaps, if the Republican Party continues toward protection and convincing the rest of the world that it could be, a more reliable globalist partner. Will it be able to do that? Probably not. In Man and Technics, Spengler basically said the Orientals already had their chance, right? They already had an ancient empire that rose and collapsed. They already had peak civilization. Whites were just the last to do it. We're the most recent ones. We're going through our own story of decline that's similar to all the other cultures that archaeologists were digging out of the rest of the world and discovering. And so what's left is a meek attempt by Oriental cultures. This is the 1930s. He was looking at Japan chiefly to just cast off this new colonial yoke that had been laid on him in the last 100 years by the West, ever since the age of sail turned into the age of steam powered ships and the opium wars and forcing Japan into modernizing had shook the world and was still shaking the world. And Spengler's prescience meant that in just 8 short years, you'd have Japan. Well, I guess it would be 10 years after the publication of Man and Technics Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, for those of you who don't remember, like the opening scene of the movie Pearl Harbor with the big map, they rolled up all the UK's imperial interests in the Pacific as well, and the final vestige of the Dutch imperial interests. So he said this is just a mimicry, right? They're just mimicking techniques of the West, and they're not improving upon them. And so when you see breakthroughs like DeepSeek, and when the dust settles, they're like, well, the breakthrough is really just a little more efficient because they have to be more efficient because they can't get all the good chips as easily. And it's like, okay, that's not, it doesn't constitute any kind of quantum leap here. This isn't an actual phase shift. So maybe if a technique would be something like global diplomacy, That's pretty esoteric, right? But you can imagine that. We don't have complex multinational systems until after the massive, like alien-esque technological breakthrough of Nazism in the 1940s and the kind of parting out of the Nazi alien technology bounty, wherever that stuff came from. That's how we got into space. That's how we got jets. That's how we even got like night vision and assault rifles. The digital computing revolution was the tail of World War II cryptography and counter cryptography efforts. So these massive technological breakthroughs and all the infrastructure that's laid down from east to west over that 6-year period is then established in the new world order, the first and second world at each other's throats for 40 years, and then the last 30 years of the unipolar moment that China's now emerging from. So China needs to be wired into global networks to avoid the fate that befell Japan 40 years ago. Trump is talking about Japan eating our lunch, right? Japanese killers getting the best of the United States. Yet, quite simply getting Japanese uh, central bank to burst its own bubble and start investing in offshoring created that lost decade. Part of the middle income trap for developing economies means that when the great power of the 20th century, the United States, exports protection, meaning tariffs, strong national economies based on production, to countries like Japan in the wake of the war, to the constitutive countries of Western Europe to keep them from going communist in the wake of World War II through the Marshall Plan, that they're only allowed to rise and go so far before they constitute a new regional hegemony. And then you have to convince them, maybe by hook or by crook, right? Maybe you need to make a run on their bank because they forgot you hold the financial power over them, that you issued their debt, that you trained them, that you became the chief market for their goods. And in that case, you had a near monopsony power over like Toyota Camrys. That's when you saw the Japanese induced into building automotive plants in Ohio, in Tennessee. That's when you saw Japanese hardware start to get made in China, actually in South Korea first, right? And so this is like it's like a swarm that moves across the world and leaves little factories in its wake, but only factories that represent a technology in its own time. America never built a 1990s Toyota Camry. The Japanese built it here. And the South Koreans probably aren't building the EVs of the future that China is. I got I got a cough, excuse me. So you have to somehow avoid the middle income trap. You have to avoid being left behind. And for China to do that, they have to escape the United States' financial power over China. But there is no alternative on the horizon to that, not now. And there's certainly no military affinity inside BRICS, given that Iran is a member and they're getting eaten up with no assistance. But Israel's in the same kind of situation. They don't want to be completely beholden to a bunch of potential Israeli citizens that will never live in Israel. They want to get out from under that. And this is a distinctly like GOP coded Zionist input. So getting their tentacles into global development will allow them access to weapons, technology. A big part of what they do is export cybersecurity services, which I think the middleman capabilities of cyber owning someone's cybersecurity should be obvious. So China's seeking to recapture Israel. And for one reason, Israel dominates American lobbying efforts. So if you could tap into their network, you're doing pretty good. You guys probably saw Trump today, or maybe yesterday, issued another 90-day stay on banning TikTok. I got a cough. Hang on. Just letting that one hang there. That was a well-timed cough. Just let that one hang there in the room. The major US stockholder in TikTok from the earliest stage, and ByteDance, its parent company, is the same guy who funded Netanyahu's judicial reforms that caused all those riots that maybe weakened the Israeli deep state leading up to October 7th. I think that's the good cop explanation, right? Months and months of Israeli deep state liberals spearheading protests against the Netanyahu regime led them to a weakened security posture and it's so they missed all the signs leading up to 10/7. But yeah, that's Jeff Yass, Yass, the richest man in Pennsylvania. Him and his partner Arthur Danchik are the major funders of this attempt at creating something like a federalist society inside Israel through the I think it's the called the American Friends of Kohelet. So look, that's all to say like TikTok is a distinctly Chisraeli phenomenon, right? And when Trump brokered the first kind of peace between I don't know what American data security interests in TikTok in the first administration, he forced Jeff Yass and ByteDance stockholders to put all the American data that TikTok collects into the hands of Larry Ellison, who for like 40 years, almost every year for the last 40 years, has held the title of world's richest Jew, a close friend of Netanyahu, so close that he is a witness in Netanyahu's corruption trial that's been put on hold by the endless permanent war footing in Israel. He's basically Palantir 1.0, right? If you look at the career trajectory of Oracle, Ellison's cash cow, and Palantir, they both get started for the same reason in different eras. In the late 1970s, Larry Ellison is working on a CIA database project called Oracle, and decides to jump right out of CIA contracting and start a giant, totally not CIA associated public database company called Oracle that nobody seems to know what Oracle does. I'll I found tweets where guys are like, I work in IT. I've done over 200 Oracle whatever installs, and I couldn't really tell you what it does either. And Larry Ellison has taken on this role of kind of the grand vizier of, Silicon Valley venture capital. He's one of Elon's earliest mentors. He mentored many of the PayPal mafia types. He's in his 80s, and it was just revealed less than a year ago after a massive donation was made, I think, to the University of Michigan. I can't remember where. One of you guys might remember what college it was made to. If it was Michigan, it was especially sketchy to their football program from his secret 20 something Chinese wife. Not coughing this time, just letting that one hang there. Okay. So the Chisraeli thing, like TikTok is the perfect example. And yeah, at the same time, I'm sure Larry Ellison, beating down Trump's door along with the rest of them to say, like, just two GBU 57s on 4 now, sir. Just try 1B2. We'll give you all the credit. He's saying like, "Oh yeah, okay, I guess we'll give TikTok another 90-day reprieve." So look, it's all over the place. TikTok, in and of itself, if you're to believe its biggest detractors in the United States, is actually some kind of psyop where they say, "Hey, look, if you go on what's it called in China, like Douyin or something, whatever the Chinese label TikTok is, it's all like Chinese traditionalism. They're all trying to undo these, 35 years of Maoist cultural destruction. They're trying to undo the decade of cultural revolution that, destroyed Chinese historiography. They're trying to like, what is it called? Like Hanicize it or whatever. They're trying to, engage in a Sinicization that evens out the 50 plus um, Chinese minority groups into one single Han oriented imagined tradition. And they have like virginal beauties in 18th century styles with their hair done up in chopsticks, cooking fish in a river or whatever, right? Look, she's chopping up a green onion on a rock, and she's carrying a bundle of sticks on her back to build a fire to bake a clay pot that she'll cook that fish in. That's incredible. But in the United States, it's I don't need to get into it, right? It's just like a vector for OnlyFans. It's like the OnlyFans conversion algorithm. Is that the Chinese influence? Or is that Jeff Yass and Larry Ellison dapping each other up for forever, right? What's the Orwell quote? A boot stamping on a face forever. It's Jeff Yass. It's Jeff Yass and a freshly Botox Larry Ellison dapping each other up forever. And 15% of non-obese American teenage girls have an OnlyFans account. But in China, Wang Huning is cracking the whip and enforcing Chinese Zoomers to spend no more than 2 hours a day playing video games. the on Chinese TikTok, when they catch a twink or a lady boy or a tranny, they force that has a high count following. They force them to volunteer for the Chinese army, and then they show them like defeminizing and going through boot camp and learning how to kill the Yankee pig dog to take back Hong Kong or whatever. Little different. But is that really China's influence? Or look, Jeff Yass got rich applying computers to off track betting. That's literally the story. That Trump clip of him getting in the Tesla and saying, it's all computer. That's what Jeff Yass did. That was some like fat Philly mobster running a numbers racket in the 1980s when Jeff Yass showed him his first week of receipts. It's all computer. So yeah, at the same time, figures like Yass also essentially run their own intelligence agencies. When you read about how Susquehanna, his investment firm, operates, they're wired into the global economy. So, for globalism to reliably survive and for China to move up the value chain and become financialized and to create some kind of sinocentric financial hedge in the way that Wall Street eventually competed and then overcame the city of London, China's got to move up the value chain. And maybe it's not so bad, right? What happened to English influence and money after they lost massive amount of market share, after they became the secondary point of commerce and financial conversion? Well, they just invested heavily in American real estate. They also became a kind of legitimating power where all these proceeds that went into their very august liberal educational institutions are still the finishing schools for transatlantic modes of thought. It's no mistake that London is seen as the epicenter for joint UK and American or Five Eyes intelligence operations against the Russians. So, this kind of underreported concept. It's overreported in Russian media, which I'm sure very few of you are reached by, that the Great Game, which starts in the 1830s, Britons bounce back after losing the First Empire against the United States and duking it out with post-revolutionary France for a quarter century. The bounce back is the Great Game. It's to oppose Russia's rising fortunes in the Eurasian continent. And that's still going on, right? The tournament of shadows is what the Russians call the great game. So the UK is uniquely focused on breaking up the western side of Eurasian consolidation, and the United States is convinced to do that quite easily. Ever since the Great Rapprochement in the 1890s, but more singularly, the American Ivy League institutions were always Anglo-centric. So they represent a kind of elite finishing school society. They are a legitimator, right? They confer a legitimacy upon your status as more of an old world transatlantic type. So maybe that's what the US becomes in a rising uh I guess Chinese financial sphere, the Silicon Valley types who built, make no mistake, built China's dual use economy through investment over the last 30 years, built the Chinese tech economy. Um, have been kind of crowbarred away from doing that by the Biden administration to the point that they fled for the Trump administration. The Biden administration, like they did with Israel, tried to divorce China from Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley responded the same way Israel did. They gave hundreds of millions of dollars to Trump to beat Biden and eventually had to beat Harris instead. And a lot of those Biden era restrictions have been softened or rolled back. At least figures like Jensen Huang are pretty convinced that they can dictate the terms of their trade, otherwise banned resources with the Chinese simply by, dumbing down some of these AI chips that they provide. So there's a reason why China seems like a pacing competitor, but it's a very old play in the book to say, like, I'm going to build up an enemy so I can gain political power because I am the only one who knows how to solve the problem I created. Silicon Valley guys are like, oh my God, China's built all these drones. Oh my God. Private equity does this too. The senator, the junior senator from Pennsylvania, McCormick, it came out during his race in 2024 that while running, was it Dalio's old firm? I can't remember the name of it right now. Um, he invested in China's largest state producer of fentanyl. His private equity firm invested in the production of fentanyl that then went on to destroy the lives of Pennsylvanians. And he smeared his opponent in that race as somebody who had facilitated, addiction or whatever in Pennsylvania from a political angle. So if Dave McCormick ever got out there and said, like, we have to solve, he sounds like a 12-year-old, we have to solve the problem of Chinese fentanyl that you created, that you got rich creating. It's no different with drones. It's no different with software as a service. China is still largely dependent on more advanced American bureaucratic services and financial services. There's a heavy consultancy industry over there that they don't know what to do about. They've attempted to put pressure on their kind of bridge executives that have Chinese citizenship but work for these large consulting firms. They'll put them on like house arrest. Obviously, consulting services at the like Fortune 50 multinational corporation level are a incredibly uh, valuable provider of intelligence to intelligence agencies. They have the ability to place highly ranked non-official cover agents. There's an entire division of the CIA called the National Resources Division that exists just to convert and place international executives or like junior executive level multinational corporation employees to kind of aid them in inserting air quotes, right, retiring CIA operatives into the Fortune 500 world. Gina Haspel, who was CIA director under Trump, had run the National Resources Division before leading the CIA. Her mentor, Hank Crumpton, he ran NRD before that. It's kind of where they put like the black ops guys out to pasture at the end of their career. And, I see Crumpton somewhat regularly on the timeline with Josh Wolf of Lux, the venture capital partner of Andreessen Horowitz. He recently hired Brett McGurk, America's chief Middle East diplomat for many years, who's now in private practice, who maintained a very even line as a professional diplomat, at least in public. And as soon as uh, the, let's just say, ethnic Zionist Josh Wolf snapped them up, Brett McGurk is on CNN 5 nights a week advocating for America to bomb Iran's enrichment facilities. So having a global posture is important if you're trying to get out from under America as a global hegemon. This is kind of the point of multipolarity, not as a system of nationalist interdependencies, but just as a means of hedging against the unpleasant aspects of the US's dollar hegemony. But it's a responsive empire. And a lot of that is because it brain drains everybody with an aptitude for Machiavellian financial activity into the United States. Have you guys ever seen the types of figures that run major accounts at Wall Street institutions? They are from anywhere. They could be from anywhere, and they are from literally anywhere in the world. So, part of the response to this is dialing back sanctions. Trump even ran on this. He said tariffs are a better way of in fact sanctioning countries rather than sanctions because sanctions will drive these countries away from the use of the US dollar. They'll look for alternatives. And so if we just tariff them instead, if we just create a common boundary that all countries have to move over, they have to pay to access our domestic market, that's a better way of extracting rents from them. And at the time, Trump was running on this idea of replacing the income tax with tariff revenues. There seems to be some of that on the horizon, but tariffs infuriate free traders. And nowhere was that more acute than in this new coalition of tech donors to the Trump administration, which, as I mentioned earlier, totally involved in agitating for U.S. entry into the war against Israel, or sorry, Israel's behalf against Iran, as well as some of the hangers on, some of the Iranian hangers on are advocating for a kind of distinctly Iranian interest within that. That's also conjoined with Jewish finance and technology power. So it is globalism. It is literally the highest value tier. It created the first tranche of 20 something billionaires in human history that were self made. They're going to see it as kind of the ultimate extension of Darwinian law without faith epistemology. It is how you win. And so, if this is kind of globalism's greatest exponent, if this is globalism's current peak, then that's what you have to compete with. So, China's not going to get involved with Iran because China would probably rather have the keys to an F-35 than a shitty ballistic missile or whatever, however you want to draw these comparisons. And look, maybe for the gearheads in the audience, I hope that answers your question. If you guys aren't familiar with my content, then you may be shocked and disturbed at the length of the monologues here, but it's nothing to me. So look, here's a pivot. How about the gear aspect? I'll finish Raibua's thread here. So she says China isn't intervening because it can't. If China comes out publicly to support and defend Iran, it would provoke hostility from Israel, which it needs in terms of tech cooperation. China plays a double game. More importantly, they help Iran indirectly, which provides good cover. China massively buys its oil and delivers chemicals Iran needs to develop its arsenal, and that's working. At the end of the day, their goal is to weaken U.S. posture, and they're sitting and waiting for Khamenei's next moves. He had a deal, and the Chinese advised on it. I think she's referring to maybe the tie up between Saudi and Iran several years ago that reintroduced diplomatic relations for the first time in a decade. They also protected him at the UN. Highly likely they think he screwed up. After the pager attacks, China realized it made a wrong bet and appointed a new ambassador to Israel with the explicit intent on helping the China Israel bilateral relationship. They're going to make a value judgment. Iran does not control the entire United States national level legislature. Israel does. I read an article about that today. I think it was in Axios, and you get these Hill staffer quotes off the record where they're like, "Yeah, all this opposition to war with Iran and the United States, that's just influencer shit. They're not on the Hill, right?" When the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a distinct and separate entity from the regular CFR, just the Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR is a George Soros kind of Euro-liberal think tank that has a lot of interests in understanding the new divisions inside Republican foreign policy. They pointed out Jeremy Shapiro is the ECFR head in the United States. He's a former State Department employee. And he said, when he was trying to explain to these European interlocutors that aren't familiar with American politics on the ground, when he had to explain what he meant by premicists or neoconservatives in the modern age, because no one will admit to be a neocon anymore, ECFR changed the qualification. The name is now, premicist, meaning they think the United States can handle all problems globally. They're still American exceptionalists. Alex Karp's three-front war that Nick talked about the other night. We could take on Russia, Iran, China all at the same time. No sweat. We are America after all, brother. And so to qualify that, he said, you mostly see premicism within the U.S. legislature, especially the Senate. No other ideology. The realists, who are now called the prioritizers because they prioritize the Indo-Pacific theater, and the restrainers, who used to be slurred as isolationists, they haven't made any inroads into the Senate. And the place you'll find premicists, neoconservatives, essentially like arm to arm, is in the Senate, even in the Democratic Party. Do you think Chuck Schumer isn't rubbing his hands with glee, waiting for that first massive ordnance penetrator to bust through the ceiling of the Fordow Enrichment Hall. Give me a break, right? He jumps on stage at the what was it, APAC? My name Shuma is like Shomer, the Hebrew shield of Israel. There's a clip for that. So, okay, on to the gear, right? I promised a little gear discussion. One side conversation I've seen, one undercard I've seen in this ongoing exchange of hostilities between Iran and Israel is that it undermines this new defense technology, tech industrial complex play through the Trump administration to replace, as you saw Elon posting about around December, January, I can't remember exactly. He took a picture of some like Chinese light show drone swarm in the daytime and said, like, who would buy F-35s anymore? All you need is, a bunch of toys with a 5 mile range. All you need is a bunch of toys with a 5 mile range that could carry a soda straw's worth of explosive, something that would leave a scorch mark on a building. If you leave 1,000 scorch marks on a building, it's over. If you could get 1,000 toy drones that can only go 1 mile, if you could start them 1 mile away from an aircraft carrier, and they would leave 1,000 straw-sized scorch marks on an aircraft carrier, it's over. That would only cost $1 million. And obviously I'm straw manning that to be light, but yeah, I don't know if any of you guys are gear guys. When you start talking about, you see like, hey, Lightning 2, and then a guy, I'll see the request pop up, and he'll jump in and say he can't stand it. Say F-35 A, B, or C. You're like, well, what do you think, bud? So yeah, Israel. You notice nobody's talking shit about the F-35 anymore, and it was the same thing with the F-15. I don't mean that anybody was denigrating the F-15 Lightning, the 50-something-year-old air superiority fighter, but if you go and look at that vaunted 100 whatever to 0 kill death ratio the F-15 has over its communist bloc opponents and some French export fighters, you'll notice like 60 something percent of those kills came from Israelis just dumping on Arabs in the 70 probably the 80s and 90s. And so it's the same with the F-35. I don't know that the United States has ever used an F-35 in combat. Israel certainly has. And so this concept that like, dude, what if we just had like, if we just, okay, so F-35 costs $200 million each over the entire lifetime of the F-35 for 60 years with all its parts, and the 1.5 military-based school teachers you have to hire to support the 48 people that will work on this F-35 while it's there and the pilot, and they have 1.5 kids at each base. And so, you know what I mean? Like there's this entire network effect that's wrapped up in the total projected price tag of one of these things. But some guys see it and say, $200 million. What if we bought $201 million drones? First of all, nobody knows what $1 million drone looks like because there's a beaten zone. There's a dead area in between like $50,000 drones and like $30 million drones. If you guys are paying any attention to the Air Force's collaborative combat aircraft, I guess, experimental program that's underway right now. They've made two down selects. One is from a company acquired by Palantir spinoff Anduril, and that is they was some stupid name. That's like the YFQ 48 or 44 or something like that. And then General Atomics, which, despite the name, is America's kind of legacy drone manufacturer. They make the Reaper and the Predator drones. They have a competitor as well. The struggle with those is to get their price down to like $20 million while also maintaining enough internal capacity to operate alongside a, fifth generation aircraft in the Indo-Pacific, which has massive distances that need to be covered. Basically from America's West Coast all the way from like Juneau to San Diego is where those bases could be, to the midpoint between that and Japan or Guam would be like the Aleutians or Hawaii, and then the aforementioned Guam, and then it's what, on to Australia, on to Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan. Vast distances require a lot of fuel, and the armaments that are required for beyond visual range air to air missile fights, like you saw between Pakistan and India last month, require gigantic missiles, gigantic air to air missiles. You guys may have seen the flex shots that the Navy put out of the aerial version of the Standard Missile 6 placed on a Super Hornet called AIM 174B. It's the size of a fucking telephone pole. These are the missiles needed to engage combat air patrols from near peer opponents at long ranges. So you need big, heavy, fully fueled, stealthy, which means they have to store all their weapon and fuel internally and can't emit actively. And they have to be a drone. And you could look at the parity or disparity between Israel and Iran, where Israel has gained air superiority by knocking out Iran's ground based air defenses, its integrated air and missile defense system. And they've done that, first of all, with standoff munitions fired from hundreds of miles away from stealthy platforms that may be beyond, even radar's ability to resolve them when the weapons bays open up and the standoff cruise missile pops out, or launching air launch ballistic missiles at long distances, like the ROX missile, to knock out with extreme precision Iran's ground based surface to air deterrent, opening these corridors into the country. And then attacking whatever's left of its pretty meager, ancient, underfunded, undeveloped Air Force. And if you believe the Hasbara on this stuff, which is a pretty healthy qualification, or you believe Trump's tweet, we own the skies over Iran. Congratulations to all the Americans in chat. Congrats, we own it. You have earned one new possession, the ability for free, unrestricted aerial movement over the Iranians. So, perhaps the debate there is either over or they're going to have to figure out a way to drastically reduce the costs of gigantic drones that are capable of these kinds of effects. Because you can't really replace the kinetic energy of a 1-ton JDAM. A lot of people had these theoretical debates about the power, relative power of intermediate range ballistic missiles. They said, well, hey, those warheads might not be very heavy because, if you look at those gigantic rockets, I saw Israel's ambassador to the United States, Yechiel Leiter, on CNN today, and he said, they're like a giant school bus. That's the size of one of these Iranian ballistic missiles. Imagine a giant bus filled with fuel and explosives launched into space. Almost all of that giant rocket is just to get whatever's at the end to the target. And there's been talk about some of these Iranian hypersonics, that may use the boost glide vehicle, flies much lower than a typical ballistic trajectory, kind of glides on the troposphere, whatever. I'm not a meteorologist. Whatever the very super high altitude, but not quite space, the boundary of space and the atmosphere is. And you've seen those incredible videos of these things coming in hot and slamming into a building, and that crazy spherical shock wave that came off one of them. But there's obviously not a lot of chemical explosive power when those hit. There may be a lot of kinetic impact, but there's not a lot of brisance, right? Shattering power that high explosives have, which move at, tens of thousands of feet per second when they're ignited. So you do see the limitations of this concept of like, hey, we can underinvest or basically divest from having an Air Force capable of projecting strike, and instead we'll rely on standoff weapons only. Well, you know, I guess from at least again, we have to rely on what the Israelis are saying, or maybe you could do some open source matching to those crazy like Terminator 3 ending style videos from Iranian cell phone cameras of like 50 missiles taking off at once. Those are crazy. They're not ending up, at least on the other side, in the Israeli smartphone videos. So perhaps that protective screen of American guided missile destroyers, and I think British guided missile destroyers are also shooting down some of these incoming missiles. Of course, the Israelis have a terminal high altitude aerial defense battery from the United States on the ground, and they have their own, arrow. And what's the one that has the funny nose? Dolphin or something is like David Sling. That's it. The intermediate range one that literally it has a stereotypical Jewish nose if you look at the missile. And then of course Iron Dome, the short range solution. They also have, I think, at least one U.S. Patriot battery that was relocated from Ukraine shooting down those missiles. It's not the Gulf War, right? There's really no question of the effectiveness of counter ballistic missile systems, of BMD. If you look at even the basic concepts these advanced systems are using, like the most recent block of the Standard Missile 3 that's being fired from Navy vessels into space to knock out these missiles, these exo-atmospheric kill vehicles, these EKVs, that are not explosive. They're just a little kind of jet-oriented vehicle that gets in the way of a predicted plotted ballistic missile trajectory. These all came out of the Reaganite Star Wars program, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Everyone mocked it while it was underway 40 something years ago, and they mocked it in the 1990s when it was divested from and killed. And they're not mocking it now. Clipper, DCX Clipper, which was supposed to be the reusable leg of putting these implements into space, this architecture, right? These satellites that could look down at the Earth and track these weapons as they moved up toward them, and the systems like vehicle, missile-borne EKVs that could move into space and take on these threats. They're real. The Falcon 9, SpaceX came right out of DCX Clipper. The IP is largely very similar. And of course, you're seeing the variety of these counter missile or ballistic missile defense systems being deployed in theater to great effect. At the same time, Iran was totally reliant on Russian surface to air missile systems that seem to have been accurately countered by fifth generation Joint Strike Fighter, which is why the Joint Strike Fighter was developed largely in the 1990s. What became the F-35 was based on the negative experiences of the United States in Vietnam and in the 91 Gulf War, where only uh, stealthy aircraft were able to reliably attack precisely Iraqi targets in the opening phase of the war due to an integrated air defense system. We couldn't even move the vaunted A-10 Warthog in to support troops in close air support, or even F-16s, because they were too visible on radar, could be targeted. And of course, in Vietnam, you just ask John McCain. Well, you can't ask John McCain anymore, but dozens or hundreds or whatever of American fighter pilots shot down from surface to air missiles, put in prison camps. And then Israel's experience in the early 1980s in a bit of a turkey shoot over Lebanon. I think it was the 82 Lebanon aerial war. And then Israel using those techniques to great effect. Or maybe it was 82 when they turned the page and used it against the Arabs, where Israel used drones to get Arab surface to air missile radars to designate and then attack them with anti-radiation weapons. But maybe it was 73 where Israel went up against the same Soviet bloc weapons that had been used to great effect against the same American planes in Vietnam that Israel was just flying against the Arab armies. So the concept of being able to suppress enemy air defenses has now moved into, that was SEAD or SEAD is now dead, right? Destroying enemy air defenses. And Israel claimed to have carved basically a corridor through Iran's air defenses months ago in the previous exchange. And then I guess they just had to finish them off this time. But you need massive airplanes with massive amounts of technology on board, massive amounts of power generation. They have to be below or at least able to conceal themselves from an enemy's ability to see them, whether with radar, optics, whatever. And they got to be able to deploy weapons that have enough power and enough range to move through the envelope between those 2 points and essentially kill, either a mission kill or totally destroy the enemy's countermanding efforts. And the United States was able to do that. People poo-pooed the amount of money expended on that program. Israel was a key part of that program. some political games with other NATO nations like Turkey. And, Turkey still has yet to receive its F-35s. One interesting take I saw from Bruno Maches today was Turkey better start thinking about how they're going to arm up because they're next. Right? Israel is coming for Turkey in 2030 at this rate. They are going to run into each other. And of course, Turkey has a burgeoning, more asymmetric native defense industry that seems to fill the margins, kind of more regional actors that are outside the NATO envelope. You saw the success of Turkish unmanned aerial systems in Ukraine, and they're being used, or I think in partnership with the United Arab Emirates, backing one of the warring factions in South Sudan. But that's not going to cut it against Israel's qualitative military edge, supplied by the United States, jointly funded by the United States, jointly developed by the United States. And there's concern, this two-part discussion within the diaspora about whether as the United States, totally divest from funding Israel's military deterrent through the whatever $3.8 billion a year type resolution, whether that continues. And the ask there is like Israel becomes hand in glove involved in developing the next set of weapons. And of course, the United States is going to claim are aimed at deterring a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, right? And Israel's going to be right there developing those weapons with them. We're already developing some of those anti-ballistic missile systems with Japan, the most recent block of the Navy's Standard Missile 3, which is the counter-ballistic missile fired by guided missile destroyers. Japan has a licensed version of the Aegis radar system that is the eyes of those systems, and with Raytheon has co-developed the most advanced ballistic missile interceptor deployed by either Navy. So you can see how if Israel fully develops its bilateral ties with Japan, a free trade agreement, a defense relations agreement, Japan's problem in gaining access to the second pillar of the Australian, United Kingdom, and United States defense trilateral, AUKUS. Pillar one is the alleged provisioning of used Virginia class nuclear fast attack submarines to Australia from the United States, and the gradual development of a joint UK Australian fast attack submarine in like the 2040s, 2050s. Pillar two is the US tightly controlling the export and placement of quantum computing and cryptography, advanced seabed network sensors, access to the combined joint all domain command and control system that can match every allied sensor with every allied shooter across the entire joint force, and also access to advanced space-based technologies and counter-strike technologies. And Japan wants to be the counter-strike partner in the at least trilateral that emerged between South Korea, Japan, and the United States in the Biden administration. But I don't know what the status of that is now. South Korea's undergone some pretty extreme political changes in the years since then. And so Japan is seeking to be the space-based partner. They could see far into China, and they'll have the ability to counterstrike Chinese ground-based ballistic missile systems that could threaten Japan's role in defending Taiwan if that was ever to happen. And that may not happen, right? It may come to pass that we give Japan everything at once. It has doubled its defense spending. It's building legitimate aircraft carriers now by modifying helicopter carriers into F-35B short takeoff and vertical landing carriers. So, Japan is almost instantly acquiring by modifying existing stocks of technology, fifth generation aircraft carriers that would be equal to the aircraft carriers the United States Marine Corps employs in the Gator Navy. If that's what it wants, if as a longtime vassal of the United States, conquered in war by nuclear power, if it wants independence, if there are right-wing factions in Israeli politics that want a kind of independence from the United States, like I said, it's very nuanced. China clearly wants independence from the US financial system. And if the tech faction is able to launch themselves into IPO status by outstripping, some of these near $1 trillion defense budgets and steering them toward like, hey, dude, what if we had, what if we had a drone that was like $250,000 and it had like two RC airplane jet engines in it and it would fly, it had like a hand grenade inside it and it would fly into another jet's engine. Like, okay, all right, but hear me out though. What if we could, launch like 1 ton of fragmenting forged steel cased explosive with a little jet engine on it and pop out wings like 500 miles deep in enemy territory? What if we could do that for $250,000? The PJ dam concept, right? The powered joint direct attack munition concept. And these budgets are like the scene of brutal and intense battles. Right now, the Navy seems to be divesting from its sixth generation fighter program, FAXX, FAX, which is a crazy name. That's, like a Brooklynite. Somebody from Bronx is leading up the Navy sixth gen fighter program if it's called FAX, B. At the same time, the Air Force is out front, at least in the Oval Office, with a mock up claiming that its sixth generation platform is, ready to go by who knows, 2028 or something. F-47. You guys remember that? Donald Trump rolled that out. That was already 8 years ago. Just kidding. It was like 2 months ago. So that's been another kind of debate. I guess, look, when a crisis breaks out, everybody is sitting around waiting for something more concrete to happen, and they're not letting the crisis go to waste. So while they're sitting there on the couch, they break out their phone and they go after their enemies. They make a universal adapter to their haters. How can I rope my haters and their problems into Iran versus Israel? So the legacy military industrial complex fans who are in favor of exquisite, expensive capital, ships and $200 million fifth generation stealth aircraft that need to have a successful track record to spawn a $300 million sixth generation Indo-PACOM air dominance aircraft, whatever. You get the idea. Those guys are going up against the Palmer Luckies of the world, your Andurils and Palantirs, who are like, what if you what if you just leased the ability to have ballistic missile defense for me for $47 million a month, like a service? What if you let Alex Karp control the Golden Dome system and like a fucking landlord? Alex Karp comes and knocks on the Oval Office door on the first of the month and holds out his hand. Oh, you're short? Oh, only $42 million this month? Yeah. I guess Alaska will have to wait. What if hey, look, if you don't sell me some more government debt, if you don't give me the right right return on a 30-year T-bond right now, look, I'm joking, but this was part of the problem. I mean, do you remember 2 weeks ago when Elon and Trump crashed out and all of a sudden there was the sober realization that combined joint all domain command and control, the entire backbone of that is Starlink? Really forward looking stuff here. Starlink outfitted with laser links, so optical communications links between the mesh network of satellites, which makes it, nearly impossible to degrade through jamming because the satellites are looking at each other. They have an optical connection between themselves. So they have high bandwidth and high survivability. The Chinese have been tearing their hair out, oh, what if we put anti-satellite missile into space, but it blow giant cloud of talcum powder to Brock Razor. They're trying to figure out like how do we stop these things? Which also Elon is responsible for getting everybody's payloads into space now. Everybody and their dog has to hitch a ride on what NASA was coerced into privatizing through combined interests of people that went through the revolving door, like Michael Griffin. A few months ago, I saw that the former head of the United States Northcom that ran what is it? That's like the big Air Force command that basically oversees all North American air defense. Scramble the fighter jets. They look for the Russian missiles sneaking over the Arctic. That's a SpaceX employee now. So it shouldn't be some mystery as to how these, I guess, problems create themselves. But at the same time, you're leaving the future of, vital North American security in the hands of very unstable, bizarre tech guys who would rather use whatever government access they have to force the government into or coerce it or bribe it into providing all capital expenditures for their research and development costs, giving them access to the huge tranche of government controlled intellectual property from decades and decades of shoulders that these government programs stand upon. Palmer Luckey calls that retrofuturism. Well, we'll just go back through the books of all the failed programs and pick out what we want. And we're just going to attach a Raspberry Pi to it, right? We're just going to, you wouldn't believe how much more computing power an iPhone has than whatever they tried to force into the form factor of this thing in the 1970s. And we can use all the rest of that space for fuel and explosives. Or you get the idea. There's concepts like that. And then, hey, we'll figure out how to commercialize some aspect of this. And then we'll achieve initial public offering through that, this joint mechanism. I will 10,000x my initial investment and I will escape in a private jet filled with Bitcoin. I'll fill my private jet with Bitcoin and I'll fly to some shithole and I'll live like Pablo Escobar in my own city state. That's the future we're staring down. And then on the other hand, you have decades of essentially like under delivery and just rape of the taxpayer through the military industrial complex. But they have experience and whatever's left of America's industrial capacities bound up in, cranking out an aircraft carrier for 15 billion instead of 12 billion dollars whenever it's convenient, whenever Huntington Ingalls Industries gets enough bribes. Whenever they get what they want, they'll let one slide out into the water. If you guys missed Matt Gates's excoriation of Lockheed Martin months ago when he was still a congressman, Lockheed Martin figured out how to, extort the government into allowing it the sole rights to repair U.S. fighter aircraft that Lockheed Martin produced. It's so bad now they're literal right of repair bills or right to repair bills like they used to have so you could repair your tractor instead of having to send it back to John Deere so they could take another limb from you. Now that's a problem in defense contracting. So the military industrial complex doesn't do itself any favors. It also leaves massive gaps in systems that could probably be useful at like the man portable level. Obviously, drones of all sizes have proven useful in the Ukrainian context, so it might be worth investigating and procuring. But Lockheed Martin is not going to do it if it's not a 100-year long program that they can get $2 trillion in cost outlays from out front. So it's been interesting to see Israel, Iran as a proxy for these kind of concerns. How do you build the munitions for the next war, right? And not the last war. But look, nobody's biting. I thought maybe we'd get some gearheads in here if I set enough like program names, planes, guns. You get a guy to look up from his guns and ammo magazine as he listens to this space in the in his den with his trophies on the wall and his safe in the back, and he'd be like, "Hey, dude, let me tell you about stopping power. Hey, F-35 versus F-47. This is just like 45 ACP versus 9 millimeter." So that was one of the other side debates I saw going on. A lot of counting coup, right? You go in and stunt on your enemies while everybody's stuck watching the train wreck. The turkey one was funny. I don't know. Maybe some of you guys have some thoughts on that. The inevitability of what they call it, Eretz Israel, Greater Israel, slowly running in to Neo-Ottoman Turkey. There's got to be a better name for it. Erdoganism. Okay, going through the bookmarks. We can't have dead air on the show. We're going through the bookmarks. Okay, I got a good bookmark here. 5 hours ago, who is this guy? Oh, okay. A guy who writes for Chabad magazine. He spotted a Chabad appearance on the bookshelf behind Netanyahu in his most recent press interview. If you guys saw some clips from that today, kind of adversarial interview with an Israeli journalist. The problem is I can't tell what they're talking about because all this stuff's in Hebrew. But yeah, he snuck a little book up there. What do they call that? Your Zoom wall? You got to have the right backdrop, a little esoteric hint. So Chabad getting a shout out. Here we go. Very freakish picture. A lot of this I just vulture out of the GCs that I lurk in. Shabbos Kestenbaum at the White House today. Wow. Shabbos Kestenbaum at the White House today. You guys probably heard all day and even last night there was going to be a big National Security Council meeting, right? Big National Security Council meeting. Trump is leaving the G7 Council in Canada early because we got to put our heads together and decide whether or not we're going to get dragged in this war with Iran. Today, National Security Council meeting all day, and Shabbos Kestenbaum, who looks to be about either Sebastian Gorka is 7 feet tall, doubt, or Shabbos Kestenbaum is 4 feet tall. The truth's probably somewhere in between. Posing with Dr. Gorka, who's the director for counterterrorism on the National Security Council. You guys may remember that little bit of transition drama where Michael Anton, who I mentioned earlier, is the director of policy planning at the State Department and the technical lead on the Iranian negotiations. He had reportedly turned down a job at the National Security Council because he would have had to work across the hallway from Sebastian Gorka, who he hates, because Sebastian Gorka claimed authorship of a Trump speech that Michael Anton actually wrote in the first administration. Serious business. But yeah, Dr. Gorka, the man that once tried to be a Hungarian national security official and was denied on the grounds that they believed he was a British spy. But hey, come on in. Hey, a British spy? That sounds like the perfect guy to have in the highest levels of the United States long-term national security policy. I saw a couple weeks ago, Stanley Fisher died, the Rhodesian-born Israeli. Yeah, well, many such cases, by the way. The Rhodesian-born Israeli monetarist, financial mastermind, where his great innovation was being made head of after spending significant portion of his career at the United States Federal Reserve. Hey, an Israeli from Rhodesia? That's exactly who we need at the conglomeration of evil US private banks. That's a patriot right there. Bring him in. After a storied career at the Fed, he went on to run. I think he was brought in by Netanyahu, who had formerly held the role of, you know, it's like I can't remember if it's the Secretary of the Treasury or it's like Finance Minister. I think is what they call it over there. So he was Israel's finance minister after Netanyahu held that position when Netanyahu came back into power. And Fisher's big innovation that saved the Israeli economy was buying like $4 billion in US dollars and storing it in Israel. That's all it takes, folks. And he was rewarded for that. You great customer right there. He's on the Dollar Customer Hall of Fame, right? The US Dollar Customer Award, rewarded by Barack Obama, high ranking official in the Federal Reserve, brought him right back. But yeah, I saw Gorka and Shabbos Kestenbaum on the sidelines of the NSC meeting today. Really cool stuff. Shabbos says, it's crazy to say Shabbos says. That's just crazy. What a crazy name. I guess it's like naming somebody Friday. I don't know. It's a little weird. President Trump has always maintained Iran must never have a nuclear weapon. Just hanging out with the NSC guy, by the way. CNN breaking story from 4 hours ago with a quote from an unnamed Israeli official. That's what I got in my bookmarks here as I scroll down. The whole operation is premised on the fact the U.S. will join at some point. Got some other stuff in here. Oh yeah, the guy who used to be head of corporate intelligence at Palantir is now the United States Chief Intelligence Officer, CIO of the United States. Sixth U.S. federal CEO. A literal direct transfer from Palantir. Good stuff. I've got you already mentioned Shervin Pishevar in front of the fields of Starlink satellites he was infiltrating across the border into Iran. Oh, yeah. Did you guys see the Heritage Foundation Oversight Project just totally misreading the room with their big report where they bought private, free market accessible cell phone tracking data for Vance Bolter or Vance Belter? That's what I've learned from watching CNN the last 2 days, aka the Vance Belter News Network. This was that nut job that whacked those two lawmakers, or I guess it was a lawmaker and her husband in Minnesota. They bought they you can just I guess it's just like those websites where you find people's birthdays or something, their home addresses. They bought this dude's cell phone geolocation data on some private market, and they tracked him all over the world. And they wrote a big thread about it. That's at It's Your Gov oversight project from the Heritage Foundation. That's cool. Heritage Foundation, by the way, running Project Esther, turning that into government policy. That's where all the campus anti-Semitism stuff comes from. So it's really cool that Heritage is super into geofencing people's cell phone data to track them all over. Definitely no chance that those two streams will combine in a terrible fashion. I mentioned that on the sidelines of this big crisis, there's knives out, right? Everybody's getting in a lick on their enemy. And Sergio Gore, the director of the Office of Presidential Personnel. Weird case here where you'd think it would be called OPP, but that one 90s hip hop hit about other people's pussy ruined that. So they call it PPO, even though it is literally OPP. So PPO Director Gore getting attacked in the anti Gore New York Post today. There's been a slow whisper campaign against Gore as secretly Russian, which is kind of crazy. Sergio Gore, I'm feeling like if it was Polymarket right now, I'm sitting at like 61% that he literally is secretly Russian. So he has a weird accent. If you ever watch his Fox News hits and stuff, he's got one of those accents where he's really trying to cover it up but can't. And his whole backstory was always like, oh, I'm Maltese. Pete Buttigieg, by the way, also Maltese. Sketchy, a little weird. But Sergio Gore, oh, I'm Maltese. I'm from Malta. I'm from Malta. And as neoconservatives dug around, they don't like Sergio Gore. He was a Rand Paul staffer for a long time, and he's seems to be very anti-neoconservative in terms of who he hires. I didn't mention it, but the Office of Presidential Personnel and its director, they're essentially responsible for vetting technically all the presidential appointees across the whole government, but they have, obviously a lot of power and responsibility in actually determining who those people will be. John McEntee was kind of one of the bright spots in the previous Trump administration who held that job in the final year and brought some non-shitty people in. I'll just leave it at that. So Gore was implicated in the ousting, or the reversal, I guess, of Trump's nomination of finance Jew Jared Isaacman to run NASA, longtime Elon collaborator and owner of one of the world's largest private air forces, which he uses to privatize military training. That's definitely not setting off any middleman alarm bells for you guys, right? Anyway, Jared Isaacman ousted. Trump turned his back on Isaacman's nomination to be NASA administrator. That was largely read at the time as Trump getting a shot in on Elon by ousting his crony. I mentioned earlier Elon's post about like, oh, what if we replaced every F-35 with 17 toy drones? Isaacman was boosting that one as well. And that's because Elon and Isaacman hate Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is not just building F-35s, they also are one of Elon's space competitors. They build big rockets, or at least they try to. And so, the idea there is you squeeze Lockheed Martin and threaten the future viability of F-35 sales, and maybe then give them some pressure, some room to retreat on the space stuff. Hey, do you want to sell 400 F-35s a year for 100 whatever million dollars a pop to friendly governments? Or do you want to lose that and we'll still whoop your ass in the space program? You'll be left with nothing. So there were a lot of angles to that. There's always a million interests involved in DC intrigue, especially at the Oval level. But Gore, around that time was being aired out for the Isaacman thing. There was a lot of little gossip in the press about how Elon had shit on Gore in front of Trump and Gore was waiting to get him back, right? Elon was like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know how to staff up anything. Gore's been surrounded by controversies like that for the last year. About a year ago, he was being aired out as the patio panhandler. That was the nickname the press was being given at Mar-a-Lago. At the time, he was enjoined with the Trump family through being their publisher of choice. He set up a publishing outfit that published Trump's weird coffee table book, where it was just Trump scrawling his like reminiscences of famous photographs from his first term. And the one with Mark Zuckerberg meeting with Trump in the Oval, where he's like, if he fucks up again, we'll just throw him in jail for the rest of his life. Right? People were bringing that up after Zuckerberg bought into the Trump inaugural and patched things over with Trump. It's like Trump had, yeah. Don't forget, Trump literally threatened to throw this guy in a pit if he won the presidency again. But Gore had also stood up a super PAC funded by Ike Perlmutter, the Israeli head of Marvel, the Cape shit titan. He's literally America's Cape shit titan, Ike Perlmutter. Disney has slowly been stealing Marvel out from under Ike Perlmutter. And, it was one of those deals where they left him in place and gave him less equity when Disney purchased the IP of Marvel. But they've slowly been eroding Perlmutter's influence over the Marvel verse out from under him. He is in his 80s. And so he was part of that group backing Ron DeSantis much earlier in the year last year, in late 2023 as well, against Disney, when DeSantis failed to make a dent in Disney's entrenched Florida political machine, its permitting machine, its zoning machine. Remember that whole bizarre conundrum? And of course, Elon Musk was in that cabal. He was against Disney after he bought X. Disney dropped all its ad buys from X. Disney's this like vast entertainment ecosystem. It owns ABC News. I mean, it's easier to say what Disney doesn't own at this point. And Elon's one of his various like Jewish financier friends, Nelson Peltz, great name, Nelson Peltz, whose son Diesel Peltz is close with Elon and had taken millions of dollars in taxpayer money out of the state of Florida to build some like COVID tracking app. It's clearly just cronyism. So you had this cabal built up against Disney that had come together to support Ron DeSantis when he was still considered to be viable. Bill Ackman was part of that group. Ackman represented activist investor interests that wanted to buy up enough of Disney to get seats on the board that they could use to militate for an ouster of the CEO. And on the other side of that was Laurene Powell Jobs, Steve Jobs' widow, who was Kamala's primary backer and the person that pushed Kamala into national level politics to begin with back in 2017. And you guys may remember it's like 15 years ago when Steve Jobs died, he was like the largest single shareholder of Disney. And his widow had diluted those shares down significantly, but still a major power. So the DeSantis versus like Kamala thing, which never took place in the general, was already shaping up in this war around Disney. And after that had largely settled and Perlmutter, Peltz had brought Elon over to the Trump thing along with DeSantis's campaign officials who had all staffed Elon's America PAC. You guys might remember this is probably like a trip down memory lane from last summer, right? So Gore, he was a pretty major impresario at Mar-a-Lago. He'd been smeared pretty aggressively, but ended up in a very potentially prime position. Of course, a lot of these staffing jobs would depend, in the case of a very strong chief of staff like Susie Wiles, on her buy-in too. But Wiles, Vance, Gore, they'd all been named as siding with Don Jr. against some of the early pushback or some of the early neoconservative operating around the Signal Gate crisis, where they were claimed to be the group within the White House that wanted to see Waltz removed. Of course, he eventually was lateraled over to the UN. So Gore had been singled out for pretty aggressive treatment by neoconservative friendly media for like the last 3 or 4 months. Even during the Signalgate thing, I saw Mark Short, Mike Pence's bald former chief of staff, who's a CNN contributor. He was the one dragging Sergio Gore's name into the Loomer Gate. Remember, Laura Loomer showed up at the White House for a private meeting with Trump. And shortly thereafter, the head military and civilian administrators of the National Security Agency were sacked, as well as, reputedly like a half a dozen National Security Council staffers. And so Gore's name was being dragged into that, and it hasn't stopped. And around then, I think it was Tablet Magazine, so back in the Mike Waltz thing, they were digging up dirt on him and saying like, "Hey, high school classmates of this guy said he used to claim he was Russian." And his name is really Gorokovsky or something like that. So I saw New York Post dredge that up today. Uh, it's getting nastier because apparently Gore refuses to submit for full on security clearance processes, the SF-86 form. So he's been on an interim security clearance since Inauguration Day. And you can't lie on an SF-86. A lot of these things could easily be a trap, right? When they know you're going to lie and they have evidence that if you do lie, then they'll get you, right? Like that FBI memo thing where they can like, oh, he lied. If I write down that he lied, then I can throw him in prison. The thing they did to, was it Roger Stone, Mike Flynn? That was kind of a favored deep state tactic in the first Trump administration. So yeah, that was a pretty funny dirty story that I saw pop up, implying Sergio Gore is secretly Russian and is hiding that and is refusing to get a security clearance because he cannot write, after saying he's been a Maltese his whole life, that he's actually Russian on that form, or lie on that form if there's evidence that he's not Maltese. And the Maltese government is saying, yeah, he lived here for 10 years when he was a kid, but he wasn't born here. We don't know where he was born, no birth records. And his name when he lived in Malta was Gorokovsky as a child. So that was another interesting one. Let's see, what else do we got? Some of this stuff is just kind of pathetic. I did see Kurt Mills crying in his latte, crying in his matcha. He's been pretty down since the Hegseth betrayal. I think a lot of the Koch network, which funds Mills's magazine, the American Conservatives, almost entirely funded by Charles Koch and has been for years now. Um, Entire editorials are, like editorial positions or jobs, like Sumatra Matra's position is entirely funded by Charles Koch at TAC. And if you look at the amount of Koch staffers and Koch network defense priority staffers that are published in the American Conservative over the last like 5 years, um, more defense priority staffers have been published in the pages of the American Conservative magazine than there are defense priority staffers now. So it's like part of the job. Defense priorities is Charles Koch's, one of several of Charles Koch's foreign policy. It's really kind of defense oriented policy think tank. So at this point, the American Conservative magazine is just a paleocon mask for naked libertarian global interests. And so it's kind of funny to see Kurt Mills doing the most. I think he's probably trying to do the right thing, hang on by his fingernails, and represent guys that are still like Michael Domino, who's still behind the curtain in the admin. knife fighting against the neocons every day. Michael Domino is like, he's like the little girl in Aliens, the Alien sequel. She like lives Newt. He's like Newt. He's like hiding out at night in the Pentagon, so the neocons don't fucking find him and kill him. So Kurt Mills is like hanging on. He's keeping the candle lit. But it has been kind of sad to see him in some of these moments where, like when he turned, he basically said like Hegseth turned back into a neocon. Hegseth had been a Coke guy for like 15 years, but before that he was a neocon guy, and they got him back. But today I saw 10 hours ago, the whiplash from last month is astounding. This is such a sad post, dude. I feel almost bad for laughing at it. But you can't be doing this. You can't cry in your beer on the timeline. Come on. The whiplash from last month is astounding. May 1st, Waltz. Meaning, so he's not talking about Signalgate. He's talking about when Waltz got lateraled over to UN mid-May. So he's recounting what he thought were victories for this bizarre libertarian paleocon link up, marriage of convenience, whatever you want to call it. I suppose what they call it is the realist restrainer faction. Realists being the paleocons and the restrainers being the libertarians and the isolationist paleocons. The whiplash from last month is astounding. May 1, Waltz, victory, right? Mid May, warp speed deals on Middle East trip, talking about Trump's big Middle East trip that left Israel out of the loop. That's now being reported on by Israeli media as just a head fake. It's just to draw the Iranians into a comfortable position so they'd be vulnerable to the Israeli perfidy. Progress with the Iran negotiations. Again, that's claimed to have been part of a long term play by the Israelis. Avoids Israel on his trip. Again, okay, ditto. Pressure on Bibi to end the atrocities. The anti neocon speech. The Hawks were down, down, down. It's like, bro, how did you fall for any of that? Like, none of us fell for it. None of us fell for it. Not that none of us fell for it. Let's be honest. Nick didn't fall for it, and we watched Nick, right? Do you remember what Nick's reaction was consistently over that same period he's describing? It was to viciously and relentlessly mock Kurt Mills at every opportunity for imagining that neocons were not manipulating the paleocons. Sad. Look, there's it's the yin, it's the yang. It's Manichaeanism. It's black and white. You're either fell for it again award or you're vindicated again award. Proven right again award. I did see that, dude. It's so funny to watch all the sleepers come out too, right? All the ones that it takes you like 2 years to find something that's like, oh, he's Jewish, by the way, or you think this guy's like a protectionist economist or something. You're like, oh, that's really interesting, but you watch enough of his stuff. Like I read Michael Scheuer. You guys remember Michael Scheuer, that kind of bedraggled CIA analyst guy that ran the Bin Laden unit, Alex Station, around the time of before 9/11, and he anonymously wrote a couple books as the global war on terror popped off. I think Imperial Hubris was the one I read, where he just castigated the American intelligence system and its shortcomings. There are a lot of these hot washes, thorns and roses, or whatever, about the failures, the intelligence failures in 9/11 afterwards. And in Imperial Hubris, he talks to some degree, probably establishes his bona fides or whatever, about like the reality of his job at the CIA. And I remember one part of it. I don't really remember a lot of it, other than he's just like super angry. A lot of the CIA guy memoirs, they just fucking hate the CIA so much. They hate it so bad. The book is just like a big fuck you to their old job, which hung them out to dry, like used them up, whatever. So none of that stuff really stands out to me. But when he talked about like the nature of analytic tradecraft inside the CIA, and one point that he made was something they called, I think, target knowledge, which is the amount of time you spend just paying attention to something. You don't have to be obsessed with it or whatever. But he said, "Oh, I had an analyst on my team at Alex Station whose job was just to look at like Al Qaeda one Al Qaeda financier, like one guy in the network in the mid 1990s that was moving money around and was a player." And that's all she did. And she renewed her, like, it's not a contract or whatever. It was like her commitment to looking at the guy like once a year. It was like a yearly thing. Like year by year, she would renew that role, meaning like she would just do that. And so what I mean when I'm the reason I'm bringing that up in relation to figures like Orrin Cass is, these guys will gradually come to your attention. This dude literally looks like Millhouse from The Simpsons and sounds like him. And so it's like, does this has to be the guy like taking public credit for ideas that Trump alone revived, but is essentially powerless due to Trump's incuriosity and lack of acumen to implement. You need other people to make the case for it. There's always a danger of it becoming Trumpism without Trump. That ship has sailed now that Trump won't be running for reelection. But at some point after like 2 years or whatever, you finally listen to a convivial interview with him and like a shit lib like Ezra Klein, and Arquette's like, "I'm Jewish too." And you're like, "Oh, oh, oh." But look, he just says it, right? And then they go on to talk about like what we need is for American commerce to return and make domestic production. And you're like, okay, I don't have any beef with this. It's kind of like Johnny Burtka from ISI, who just, dude, the guy just sounds so flamboyant. It's like, does this have to be like, why do you have to speak for things that I also support and sound like that? You know, somebody needs to get Johnny Burtka a one of those subscription boxes, but it's just some kind of cheap ass like hard liquor, like some cheap like Jewish Canadian blended whiskey. It's like Seagram 7. It's like the plastic handle. He gets the plastic handle of Seagram 7 to drink straight once a week and a carton of American Spirit Blacks. And if he survives, right? Also, he's got to watch a lot of like tough guy movies and go taxi driver style, right? And talk to the TV. And then, okay, and only then, like Bane tells Batman, then you'll have my permission not to die, but to, please don't wave your hands around when you're on camera and let your voice pitch up and sound like you're an interior designer, but you're talking about reindustrialization. Like, please. So there's, you find other problems. And then it's time for the Cyaneme to push for bunker busters on Fordal. The time comes. The shofar sounds, right? The sleepers are activated. And all of a sudden, a guy who spent the last 5 years just kind of nebbishly pecking away at like, what we need is to abolish neoliberalism. And now he's like, here we go. I'll pull it up. Orrin Cass argues far from being a resource drain, Israel will take the hits to ensure the Middle Eastern theater never threatens the West. There's your one drop rule, right? There's your Nuremberg laws, okay? I hate to say it. I hate to say it, especially after I just held forth on like negative optics being effeminate or nerdish. And then I'm like swinging it back the other. I'm overcorrecting, right? It's like when you watch like rally car drivers and they do that. What do they call it? The Scandinavian flick, where they snap the wheel one way, and you're like, oh, and then they overcorrect and they, go full lock, opposite lock through the turn in the gravel. It looks so improbable, but it's super cool. I did it. I did the Hitler overcorrection, didn't I? As a joke, okay? It is a recorded space. Anyway, that was funny too. Like, not necessarily that I'm vindicated or whatever, but maybe you learn how to be a little more, um, I don't know what, instinctive. You learn to act on your suspicions rather than just be like, whatever, whatever. I don't have the bandwidth to be that suspicious of this guy just because of that. I'm not throwing that baby out with the bathwater. When if you had breakfast and coffee, 9 hours of sleep before that, you were in a fully relaxed state, you would have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. All right, I see Donnie requesting. We'll bring him on. Curious to hear what his thoughts are. Oh, and by the way, just public service announcement. I did see the initial Nick Fuentes notification went out, but we all know as seasoned Telegram alert followers that the show will not be live until the personal Nick account announces the show. So we'll see how much time we have left. All right, Donnie, take it away.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
One note on Orrin Cass. I did a deep dive on American Compass a couple weeks ago or a month ago or something, just looking at all their connections. And they did there's a podcast or a talk you can find with a company called Capita and this kind of strange nonprofit that's really involved in, it has a lot of the people on their board are involved with like the Aspen Institute, which I think Nick mentioned as kind of this had connections to Vance at one point.
Yeah, American
Maybe,
Compass is all about like building bridges into the establishment for ideas that they hate.
and so we started looking into all the funding for Capita. You can find all their all the people, and it was starting to get like eerie where we're finding all these really strange shell companies almost that seem fake, and they all had to do with families. There were varying ranges of libtarded ones that even mentioned overt, you know, tikkun olam, and, and we just started, and it was all focused on children or families and facilitating that, and it felt like we were going down this weird rabbit hole that and of course the speaker that spoke for Capita, his name was Yuval Levine. Doesn't really sound like someone from South Carolina.
Yeah,
You know
Yuval
what I
Levin
mean?
is he's a kind of historian, right? His big thing is like contrasting um, kind of different strains in founding history. I've never read his stuff, but it might actually be interesting, especially if you go in there prepared, for whatever, right? For perspective, he seems to kind of be like the Manhattan Institute line on conservatism. Manhattan Institute gives out the Alexander Hamilton Award every year. Paul Singer gives out the Alexander Hamilton Award every year. Paul Singer and Roger Hertog, who runs the Tikva Fund, and is a chairman emeritus of the Manhattan Institute. It's like if Mike Tyson's left and right fist punched for Zog. Those two guys are the ones giving out the Alexander Hamilton Award. So,
Yeah,
but they'll have their own reading of it, right? This is like the benefit of being being in esoteriology rather than historicism. You don't have to justify your interpretations of great figures. They always just end up to be just like you. That never comes into it, right? But
right.
so yeah, Yuval Levin, I've seen his books around, and he's pretty well received by like the Hoover Institution type crowd. These are guys that are kind of trapped in the amber that they found themselves sinking in the George W. Bush era. But yeah, I mean, look, I don't think it's any crime for people to go out there and be diplomatic and make as many inroads as they can anywhere they go. I think that's, for the most part, you're going to hear people advise that, right? And they're never going to hold that against you. They don't want you to go out there and advertise your connections, though. If what you're doing is purely oriented on diplomacy, so the optics of that externally can be really tricky. People could look at what you're doing and they just see you as the same, swamp creature they've already seen. You might say like, oh, they'll see that I'm actually a frog in an alligator suit. They'll see the seam, but you don't realize like nobody gets that close to the swamp. You can't see the seam, and they're just like, this is another swamp creature. Um, at the same time, there are probably little signals, right? If a guy is like you mentioned, funding is a good example. For Cass, maybe background, right? He was like the chief domestic policy advisor to Mitt Romney in his 2012 campaign. There's also the accident of birth, right? I think the guy's literally an Israeli. You can go listen to his interview with Ezra Klein if you want a good kind of easy to digest exposition of his views. And the other thing is like don't mistake very general political positions for anything specific. This is kind of the mistake that deductivists make. Inductivists look at the specific and they generalize from that. Everything proceeds from an observation. Deductivism starts with a kind of frame of mind and it hammers everything you encounter into that. You start with the generalization, and that guides whatever specifics you come up with. That doesn't mean there's no place for deductivism, but there can be pitfalls, especially if you're trying to discern the motives of others. So when you look at something, you say use protectionism as a first principle. That's pretty weak gruel from which to feed a manner bun, okay? One of the most confusing things for students of the American system is to see just how fluid the lines were between, say, the Democratic Party and the dying Federalists, this whole period before the emergence of the Whig Party on many issues. Even Friedrich List was a Jacksonian. That makes no sense. But he was a close personal friend of President Jackson. President Jackson appointed Friedrich List to be his government representative to German Americans. I think actually to Germany, or like, Germany was still stuck in this Palatinate scheme, and it got held up in Congress. So things are not simple. They've never been simple in politics, especially around something that could benefit all kinds of communities that understand maybe a domestic harmony of interests is what draws people together. And so you're starting from nothing. List was starting from what? Dozens of palatinates that had been mediatized by Napoleonic invasion, down from hundreds. And eventually you get a German nation out of that, but not within List's lifetime. And I've used this example before. Ian Fletcher writes books about protectionism. I'm reading his most recent book. It's fantastic. It's super dense. The one that he wrote with Mark Fastel. Um, it's something like some industrial policy book. It's got a terrible title. You need good titles for books, right? Don't use prescriptive titles. Use descriptive titles. If they literally called it like Fortress America, this concept that America's ability to be autarkic would allow it if it exploited its own resources and if it drew together a domestic community around producerism and consumption within its own borders first, then it could freely engage with the rest of the world on its own terms. If it was called something like that, it would be better. I'm mostly just coping
Yeah,
for not
it
remembering the
reminds
title of
me
the
of like
book.
17th century,
Well, what's
like
unique about this
Christian
latest book?
literature that's so long.
Yeah, what's unique about this? Yeah, where they had like five titles. Yeah, the
Yeah,
never-ending
yeah,
like title
like
thing,
three
subtitles.
sentences
Yeah,
title. Yeah.
but the unique thing about this Fletcher book is it's the first one that doesn't have a foreword written by Edward Luttwak. So for whatever you guys think about Edward Luttwak, arch neocon, consummate, Israeli American political intriguer and foreign policy operator, still active on Twitter. Um, the guy that loves claiming he literally wrote the book on how to pull off a coup. Also wrote a book that they said was, had so little historical rigor involved about, was it like the nature of Roman organization or something, that it created a whole generation of historians that used it as a counter example. Like they learned what not to do from that book about Rome. Anyway, Luttwak is a staunch protectionist. Why? Because he's an Israeli nationalist. So are you all of a sudden best buddies? If I mean, we know it's totally possible for one country's nationalism to impinge upon the nationalism of another nation. That's part of what free traders use against concepts that are, irrevocably nationalist, like economic nationalism or protection, as it was called. So it's a pretty weak platform from which to like base other alliances on. And all of them are like that, right? Beware of platforming. Be very wary of people that try and draw you together based on a agglomeration of details. Um, Keith Stanovich wrote about this kind of tendency toward platforming in another terrible book title. The title's so bad you don't want to read it, but it's a good book. The bias that divides us. And the bias that he's talking about is, strictly in cognitive psychology research and not like black versus white. It's types of shortcuts people make in their cognition that get them tricked and trapped because they don't understand how vulnerable they actually are. And that, maybe there's people you'll never be able to outthink, outmaneuver, or outscheme. But if you know that, and if you have a decent working memory of some of the tactics and procedures these people employ that are like playbook operations, if you can identify them, you might know just to not engage, stay away, refuse to commit, or more importantly, treat them as somebody who's representing their own interests and remind yourself to represent your interests as well. So, yeah, I guess that'd be like my basic kind of big boy pants thing about guys like Oren Cass or even Yoram Hazoni. I'm sure any of us um, would be courteous and diplomatic and get along with just about anybody. At the same time, what's that got to do with your interests? What's that got to do with holding your line? Just because you like somebody, does that make you vulnerable to them? It can't, not in this game. And people change fast. Either they were waiting for the right moment to change or they didn't even know it, or they get bribed or coerced or whatever. I mean, anything's possible. And you're never going to have anything beyond like the threshold of circumstantial evidence at best. There's never going to be proof. There's no smoking gun. There's not going to be the secret files that you could get into, I guess, unless you're reading the Destiny Discord chat logs. So in certain cases, you will get evidence, but that's not particularly sophisticated operation. So yeah, I guess that's my take on the Orin Casses of the world. If you can identify somebody who's a scorpion that thinks they're a frog, that's still a problem for you. Even if they really believe they're one of us. If you count on that at the wrong moment, you will also drown. And then what's your recompense that you drown together, right? You guys, if you don't, if not familiar with that Russian, uh, what it's like a fable or whatever about the scorpion and the frog. The frog is about to cross the river and there's a scorpion waiting on the bank and he says, "Give me a ride on your back. I can't swim." And the frog says, "You'll sting me and we'll both die. We'll both drown." And the scorpion says, "Why would I? It makes no sense. Like, why would I do that?" And then halfway across, so the frog relents, and halfway across the river, he feels the sting, and as he's dying, he says, "We're both. Why did you do that? We're both going to drown." And the scorpion says, "It's my nature. It's my nature. Don't ever put yourself at the mercy of people who have none. That doesn't mean they're merciless. It just means deep down inside somewhere, there's something that's just not going to be there when you need it most. And whatever appeals about you to them is whatever they know they can get from you now. They're approaching you. And you also need to be able to discern whether or not somebody is actually approaching you and it's not just a coincidence or something. These things should set off alarm bells. But sophisticated actors prey on the need for human connection. It's a sad fact, but a lot of young people join movements like political movements or any other thing, hobbies, car clubs. They get into golfing, I don't know, adult softball, you name it, because they miss the human connection. And unlike, billiards, bowling league, mountain rock, local rock climbing club or whatever, politics is full of like fucked up talent scouts and people that will probably just get a thrill from stealing and destroying your innocence in a way that they think could resolve the chain of events that victimized them when they got into politics. It's full of just terrible fucking people. That doesn't excuse any of you from exiting, Nobody should quit. You shouldn't force yourself out either. And you definitely should not continue to like double down if you make a mistake and then use that weeks and months later to create an exit for yourself around some other unrelated thing that seems like you're totally blowing something out of proportion, but in fact, it's your guilty conscience at already losing your faith long ago and believing everyone can see that, and that's why you leave. Did you guys notice that Joel Davis became totally faithless after losing his political faith? Did anyone else notice that? Joel Davis literally like turned his back on Christendom when he burned out on politics. He didn't just start going out in the streets and doing the armband bullshit. That's a total dead end. I mean, you're seeing where it ends. Have you guys seen this story about some guy that threw up a Roman on like a Omegle or something in Australia, and they're like, yeah, he could get 19 years in prison now because of the Joel Davis law. Right? They're like, oh, Joel Davis burns out on politics, loses his faith, and decides to put on the pit vipers and the black hat and the GDL banner and go out and start throwing up Romans in public and hell marching or whatever with the bogans. And Australian states just started banning that. They just literally took it to the legislature and just turned it into something you would ruin your life if you did. And everybody knew that was possible. But, at the same time, you look at what the guy's saying, about Christianity or whatever. Now he's done a complete 180. So beware of faithlessness. Now, obviously, when we're talking about a guy like Warren Cass, look, that's a totally faithless religion. Anybody doesn't believe me, go read Romans. Go read Paul's letter to the Romans. It's right there. The end of chapter 2 in Romans. The stone of stumbling. I'm not here to get into a faith versus works debate that's inter-Christian, because it's pretty obvious who he's talking about in that scripture. That's probably a complete fucking landmine for me to step on right now, so I'm gonna stop talking about that. But just remember, like, there, or go read the Jewish Currents article. I posted it on my Telegram a few weeks ago, but you can read it if you just look up like Nathan Fielder Jewish Currents, right? Nathan Fielder, that show that he does where he just abuses non-Jews. It's like the new Sacha Baron Cohen shtick. Jewish Currents, which is a leftist Jewish publication, had this article. It was kind of a discussion between two Jewish liberal women, I think, and they were super disturbed by it. They literally saw that as like leading toward another Holocaust. And they pointed out how I've never seen the show that Fielder puts on HBO, but I only looked it up because John Miller was talking about how disturbing it was as a red pill viewer, and so they were pointing out, like, yeah, there are Christians on the show that just are essentially invulnerable to whatever Fielder's trying to do, because they're like, yeah, that's when I understood Christianity as something rooted in faith and not just like Judaism where we just do stuff without any faith. We just go through all the motions, right? There's 613 halakhic laws or whatever, and you just abide by as many of them as you can, but there's no faith. That doesn't exist.
Or just trick
So,
God into fulfilling them.
yeah, well, that's what I'm getting at with somebody like Warren Cass. It's blunt, but that's not a person who understands what faith is as well. So,
We've all seen the Sabbath videos, right?
well, look, I mean, it's just a totally different construct. They're never going to think even approximately close to you, no matter how much they like tariffs. Okay, tariffs are not some kind of stand-in, right? This is like uh, all the blocks have a different shape, right? If you need a triangle block to fill the triangle gap, you cannot use a circle or a square. It's not going to work. Let's see if I have any more bookmarks here. Oh man, my bookmark thing's just out of control. I did finally break through the. No, I didn't break through the Iran stuff. There's some other good stuff in here that's definitely too sensitive to talk about. I shouldn't even say shit like that. I'm too exhausted after the space. Don't raise more questions and answers, right? Maybe that's some kind of I could just play that off as like a rhetorical hook that I'd use so you guys come back to the next space. Oh, maybe he'll talk about it at some point in the future. Yeah, I'll be in the fucking Groyper nursing home by the time we talk about some of this shit. But I'm doing it again. All right, Gila Gamliel. I saw this one. Former Israeli uh, Minister for Intelligence, which I don't know. What's that, like their DNI role or something? Some kind of political role. She's promoting the regime change, Iranian Israeli crossover to get the Shah pretender back on the peacock throne. So there's some serious buy-in. I led with that. That's probably the most interesting stalking horse that few people are discussing in explicit detail. I have seen some mainstream media coverage about like, oh, Israel is kind of tipping their hand in that they want regime change, but they're not necessarily qualifying it. There was a good article maybe 2 years ago in Politico about the complete shit show that is like Iranian diaspora politics, meaning, an attempt to build a shadow government or government in waiting. It even involved that one Iranian Scientologist who at one point was like one of the arm candy types that Scientology put on Tom Cruise after his divorce. Nazanin Boniati, I think her name was. Um, she was like part of the diaspora, one day we'll be back in Tehran, brothers thing. So it doesn't sound like there's a lot of inertia behind a single candidate, but we'll see. I mean, information operations could go a long way. I don't know. Israel obviously lacks the ability to engage in some kind of extended air power campaign against Iran without total U.S. support. But we're already there, right? Like everything, almost everything they're using is either direct transfer from the United States, these heavy platforms they use to deploy these munitions, the tankers that they buy to fuel that up. It does appear that, with that flight of 24 tankers from the United States, we're probably tanking them up. We're transferring as many munitions as they want, publicly or covertly. So, we're in it. I don't doubt that there'll be some other distraction between now and the midterms. And there just isn't going to be a slate of candidates that are going to step up and point to this and say, hey, maybe we should control our arms exports a little more rigorously if they can be literally used to bring us to the doorstep of direct action against another country, which remains to be seen. We could already be there because I've been going on in this space for like 3 hours. It could already have
Did
happened.
you
While you were all here
did you
transfixed, I
see
could have
that?
missed the strike.
Uh, did you see Dominic Trippy tweet out that the White House had sent emails to politicians and political influencers that included talking points to justify the intervention?
No,
Yeah, it happened while we were in the space about
there's
10
been
minutes ago.
so many like
Em-
deletions, and
Emphasizing
I guess it is
Trump's
another minor
remarkable
point that I had in my
consistency.
bookmarks. I noticed that the Hudson Institute, the major neoconservative security policy think tank that's aligned with the GOP, their senior fellows they were behind the, promoting the America's already over, American planes are already striking Israel last night. About 24 hours ago. You guys remember that little burst, that little outburst? It was two Hudson Institute guys. I have them here in the bookmarks. Let's see. One of them, of course, is not only a Hudson Institute senior fellow, he also is like an anchor at an Israeli news network at the same time. That's look, that kind of double dip, that would be if I was Sherlock Holmes, I'd say that's a clue. Just saying. But yeah, I thought that was funny. The Hudson tie up. My bookmarks are crazy. I don't know if I can find it. All right, here we go. Jonathan Hessen, whose bio is TV7 Israel News editor in chief. Okay, he's not an anchor. Hudson Institute senior fellow, and the worst think tank name I've seen since I think there was one that was like Project for a New American Security. PNAS, like bro, penis. But this is almost as bad. This would be the counterpart to penis. Jizz, JISS Israel, Jizreal, the Jerusalem Institute for Security and Strategy. Their handle is literally Jizreal. JISSISRAEL, dude. So, dude, Jizreal, like, give me a break. You can't make this stuff up, man. I guess it just doesn't translate from the original Hebrew very well. So that was being spread around. What Hessen came up with. Oh, the U.S. Air Force has begun air operations over Tehran, according to Jonathan Hessen of the Hudson Institute. That was spread by Bree Dale of Daily Wire, or contributor at Daily Wire. So she might be a bit of a freestyler. And then Hudson Institute fellow Josh Block was promoting that. Foreign policy scholar and adjunct fellow at Hudson. Former spokesperson for the USAID, APAC, Clinton campaign, and Gore Lieberman campaign, and named by the Jewish Daily Forward as one of America's most 50 influential Jews. That is quite the bio. All right. Nick just said the show is live. Everybody head over to rumble.com/Nick J. Fuentes. Says America First is live. Tonight we are discussing the caps lock Iran war and caps lock U.S. intervention, which is imminent. You are not going to want to miss it. Last night he had like 45,000 live viewers. So go over there, tune in. I'm going to do that. Thanks for tuning in to this episode. Look, our space, I guess. It's recorded, so you can find it on my profile if you want to subject yourself to however many hours you missed by coming in late. Good night.
Thanks, Wendell. Night.
Oh yeah, thanks to everybody who called in. Thanks to everybody who called in. Where are my manners?